Welcome back, my dear people. Welcome to another story here on the channel. Tonight, we're going to take a break from the outside world. Lay down, close your eyes, and let's go back to a time when time passed more slowly. While you're getting comfortable, please comment below where you're watching and what time it is there. It's always magical to see people from so many corners of the world listening together, each one with their own pillow, their own routine, their own silence, but connected by the same story. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel. That's what keeps these night trips happening every week. Imagine you're lying by a campfire, listening to someone tell an old story, one that was almost lost in time. Today, we're going back to a curious moment in history. Close your eyes and let yourself settle into comfort. Tonight, we journey back to a time when two worlds collided with devastating consequences that would reshape entire continents. Imagine yourself drifting back through the centuries, past the familiar rhythms of modern life, past the industrial age, past the Enlightenment, back to the late 15th and early 16th centuries, when European ships first appeared on the horizons of the Americas. This wasn't simply conquest, as we might imagine it from Hollywood films or adventure novels. This was something far more complex and catastrophic, a biological apocalypse that unfolded slowly, inexorably across generations. As you listen, allow your breathing to slow and deepen. Feel yourself becoming an invisible observer to one of history's most profound transformations. When indigenous civilizations that had flourished for millennia encountered forces they could never have anticipated, the story we'll explore together isn't one of simple military victory or defeat. Instead, it's the tale of how disease, cultural misunderstanding, technological disparity, and human ambition combined to create a catastrophe so complete that entire ways of life vanished forever. Let the weight of your day begin to lift as we examine how ordinary people much like yourself faced circumstances so extraordinary that survival itself became an act of profound resilience. Picture the moment when lookouts on Caribbean islands first spotted strange vessels on the horizon, ships unlike anything they had ever seen, with white sails billowing like clouds, captured by human hands. The observers couldn't have known they were witnessing the arrival of forces that would fundamentally alter the biological, cultural, and social fabric of two continents. These weren't just ships carrying men seeking gold and glory. They were vessels of transformation, carrying within their holds the seeds of change so profound that the very air, water, and soil of the Americas would never be the same. As we move through this history, notice how your muscles begin to relax, how your mind can wander between the details of daily life in these distant times and the comfort of your present moment. The past can teach us about endurance, about adaptation, about the fragility and strength of human societies. Tonight, let these lessons wash over you gently, like waves against a distant shore, as we explore why survival in the age of conquest required more than courage. It demanded the ability to navigate a world turned completely upside down. The civilizations that Europeans encountered were not the primitive societies often portrayed in simplified histories. These were complex cultures with sophisticated agricultural systems, remarkable architectural achievements, intricate religious beliefs, and social structures that had evolved over thousands of years. From the great cities of the Aztec Empire to the terraced mountains of the Inca, from the ceremonial centers of the Maya to the longhouses of the Iroquois, the Americas were home to millions of people living rich, meaningful lives according to worldviews that would soon be challenged in ways they could never have imagined. Let yourself sink deeper into relaxation as we prepare to witness these moments of first contact, not through the lens of modern understanding, but through the eyes of people who had no framework for comprehending what was about to unfold. Feel the weight of inevitability settling over this narrative, like a heavy blanket that both comforts and constrains, as we explore how the collision of worlds would create ripples that continue to shape our present day. The morning of October 12, 1492, dawned clear and bright over what Europeans would later call San Salvador. Imagine yourself standing on the beach of this Caribbean island, feeling the warm sand between your toes and the gentle caress of trade winds carrying the salt scent of the sea. The Taino people who called this island Guanahani had risen as they had for countless generations, preparing for another day of fishing, farming, and the quiet rhythms of island life. They could not have known that this particular dawn would mark the beginning of the end of their world. Christopher Columbus and his crew had been at sea for over 2 months, their supplies dwindling and their confidence wavering. The Admiral of the Ocean Sea, as Columbus styled himself, had convinced the Spanish crown to fund his westward journey based on miscalculations and wishful thinking. He believed he was near the Indies, the source of precious spices and silk that European merchants coveted. When the lookout on the pinta-spotted land, the Europeans felt the relief of salvation. For the indigenous peoples who would soon encounter them, it was the beginning of an unimaginable catastrophe. Picture the scene as Columbus and his men rowed their boats toward shore. The Taino people gathering at the water's edge must have felt a mixture of curiosity and concern. These strangers had pale skin, unlike anything they had seen, wore strange coverings over their entire bodies despite the warmth, and arrived in vessels that seemed impossibly large. The Europeans, for their part, saw naked or lightly clothed people with copper-colored skin, wearing what appeared to them to be primitive ornaments and simple clothing. The first exchanges were tentative, conducted entirely through gestures and expressions. Columbus had brought along small mirrors, glass beads, and hawk's bells trinkets he believed would appeal to simple people. The Taino offered parrots, balls of cotton thread, and small pieces of gold. What seemed like a peaceful trade to both sides was actually the beginning of a fundamental misunderstanding that would have devastating consequences. Columbus wrote in his journal that the natives would make excellent servants because they were intelligent, would repeat words spoken to them, and appeared to have no weapons. He noted that they touched the swords of his men with curiosity, cutting themselves on the sharp blades because they had never seen metal weapons. This observation, recorded matter-of-factly, reveals the technological gulf that separated these two worlds. The Taino lived in what Europeans would call the Stone Age, using tools made from stone, bone, and wood that had served their needs perfectly for thousands of years. The Spanish had steel, not just weapons, but tools that could cut through wood and stone with ease. They had gunpowder, creating sounds like thunder and smoke like volcanic eruptions. They had horses, animals that seemed to merge man and beast into a single terrifying creature. Most importantly, though they didn't know it yet, they carried within their bodies microscopic passengers that would prove more devastating than any weapon. The pathogens of old world diseases. As the days passed, more encounters followed the same pattern. Europeans arrived with ships full of men seeking gold, believing they were in the Indies and that the people they met were Indians. They established the encomienda system, essentially a form of slavery disguised as a labor arrangement. Spanish colonists were granted control over indigenous communities and could demand tribute and labor in exchange for protection and Christian instruction. The indigenous peoples found themselves forced to work in mines and plantations, their traditional ways of life disrupted by the insatiable European hunger for precious metals. The Taino, like other indigenous groups, initially tried to accommodate these strangers. Their societies often had traditions of hospitality and reciprocal exchange. They shared food, offered shelter, and attempted to establish relationships based on their understanding of how different groups should interact. What they couldn't comprehend was the European concept of ownership, the idea that land, resources, and even people could be possessed as property. Columbus established the first permanent European settlement in the Americas on the island of Hispaniola. Within a decade, the indigenous population had been decimated. The Spanish demanded gold tribute from every person over 14 years old, an impossible burden in a society that had little use for the metal beyond ornamental purposes. Those who couldn't pay faced having their hands cut off. Those who fled to the mountains were hunted down by dogs bred for warfare. The Spanish missionary, Bartolomé de las Casas, who witnessed these early years of colonization, wrote detailed accounts of the brutality he observed. He described how Spanish soldiers would test the sharpness of their swords by cutting indigenous people in half, how they would hang groups of 13 people at a time in honor of Christ and the 12 apostles, how they would roast people alive over slow fires. His accounts, while possibly exaggerated to make a point about the need for reform, provide a glimpse into the casual violence that characterized these early encounters. But the violence wasn't just physical. The Spanish brought with them a worldview that could not coexist with indigenous understanding of the cosmos. They saw the elaborate religious ceremonies, the complex mythology, the sophisticated astronomical knowledge of indigenous peoples as devil worship that needed to be eliminated. Catholic missionaries worked tirelessly to convert indigenous populations, often destroying sacred objects, burning codices filled with centuries of accumulated knowledge, and forbidding traditional practices. The process of cultural destruction was as systematic as it was devastating. Spanish colonists renamed every geographic feature, replacing indigenous names with Spanish ones. They reorganized communities, forcing scattered populations into concentrated settlements called reducciones, where they could be more easily controlled and Christianized. They introduced European crops and livestock, fundamentally altering ecosystems that had evolved over millennia. Indigenous peoples, who survived the initial waves of violence and disease, found themselves living in a world they no longer recognized. Their children were taken away to be educated in Spanish schools, where they were forbidden to speak their native languages. Their land was divided among Spanish colonists, according to European legal concepts, but had no meaning in indigenous law. Their traditional leaders were replaced by Spanish administrators or indigenous people willing to collaborate with the colonial regime. The search for gold drove Spanish exploration deeper into the Caribbean and onto the mainland. Every expedition followed the same pattern. Initial contact marked by curiosity and tentative exchange, followed by escalating demands for tribute, forced labor, and submission to Spanish authority. Those who resisted faced overwhelming technological superiority. Those who submitted found themselves trapped in systems of exploitation that slowly ground away at their communities and cultures. By 1510, less than 20 years after Columbus's first voyage, the indigenous population of the Caribbean had been reduced by more than 90%. Entire islands stood empty except for Spanish colonists and the enslaved Africans they imported to replace the vanished indigenous workforce. The great chieftains who had once ruled complex societies found themselves refugees in their own lands. If they survived at all, the pattern established in the Caribbean would be repeated throughout the USC. Americas with slight variations, but consistent results. The Europeans arrived seeking gold and glory, armed with superior weapons and an unshakable belief in their own superiority. They encountered complex societies with different values, different technologies, and different ways of understanding the world. The collision between these worldviews created a catastrophe that unfolded slowly but inexorably, leaving behind transformed landscapes and traumatized populations struggling to maintain their identities in a world that no longer had room for their traditional ways of life. Imagine yourself standing in the central plaza of Tenochtitlan in the year 1519, surrounded by the gentle lapping of canal waters against stone embankments and the soft murmur of thousands of voices speaking in Nahuatl. The great Aztec capital stretched across the lake like a vision from a dream. its temples rising toward the sky in perfect geometric harmony, its markets filled with goods from across Mesoamerica. The air carried the scent of copal incense from the temples, the earthy aroma of maize being ground into masa, and the complex fragrances of exotic flowers cultivated in floating gardens that seemed to dance on the water's surface dot into this world. Of established rhythms and ancient certainties came Hernan Cortes and his small band of Spanish conquistadors, accompanied by their indigenous allies who had their own grievances against Aztec rule. The meeting between Cortes and Moctezuma, too, the Aztec emperor, has been depicted countless times in art and literature, but the reality was far more complex and tragic than any romantic rendering could capture. Two men representing civilizations that had developed in complete isolation from each other attempted to communicate across a gulf so vast that true understanding was virtually impossible. Moctezuma received the Spanish with elaborate ceremony, offering gifts of gold, precious stones, and feathered artwork that represented the pinnacle of Aztec craftsmanship. To the Aztecs, these were diplomatic presents, gestures of respect and hospitality, extended to important visitors whose true nature remained mysterious. Some believed Cortes might be the returning god Quetzalcoatl. Others saw him as a powerful ruler from distant lands who deserved appropriate honors. The Spanish, however, interpreted these gifts as tribute from a conquered people, evidence of submission to Spanish authority. The language barrier created misunderstandings that cascaded into catastrophe. Courts relied on interpreters, most notably an indigenous woman known to history as La Malinche or Dona Marina, who spoke both Nahuatl and Maya and learned Spanish during her captivity. Through this chain of translation Spanish to Maya to Nahuatl and back, again complex political and religious concepts were reduced to crude approximations that often bore little resemblance to their original meanings. When Spanish priests attempted to explain Christian theology to indigenous audiences, they faced the impossible task of translating concepts that had no equivalent in Mesoamerican thought. The Christian notion of sin, the idea of eternal damnation, the concept of a single, omnipotent deity, these ideas were filtered through indigenous cosmologies that understood the divine as multiple, complex, and intimately connected to the natural world. Indigenous peoples heard Spanish words, but understood them through their own cultural frameworks, creating a dialogue of the deaf that would persist for centuries. The Spanish concept of ownership proved particularly difficult to communicate. When Spanish colonists claimed land by planting flags and reading legal proclamations in Latin, indigenous peoples had no framework for understanding these rituals. Land, in most indigenous cultures, was not something that could be owned in the European sense. It was sacred, alive, connected to ancestral spirits and future generations. The idea that a piece of paper written in a foreign language could transfer ownership of territory that had been home to communities for centuries was not just foreign, it was incomprehensible. Similarly, indigenous concepts of reciprocity and tribute were fundamentally misunderstood by Europeans. In Aztec society, tribute was part of a complex system of mutual obligations that connected communities across vast distances. Tributary peoples provided goods and services to the capital, but they also received protection, access to trade networks, and participation in religious ceremonies that maintained cosmic order. The Spanish saw only the flow of goods toward the center and interpreted this as a system of oppression that they could simply take over and redirect to their own benefit. Misunderstandings proved even more devastating. Spanish missionaries were horrified by what they saw as devil worship elaborate ceremonies involving human sacrifice, complex pantheons of gods associated with natural forces, and religious practices that seemed to celebrate rather than suppress human sexuality and other aspects of earthly existence. They could not see the sophisticated theology behind these practices. the careful balance of forces that indigenous peoples believed necessary to maintain cosmic harmony. Indigenous peoples, for their part, were equally confused by Christian practices. The Spanish veneration of images seemed suspiciously similar to idolatry, despite Spanish insistence that their saints were not gods. The Christian emphasis on suffering and martyrdom appeared morbid to people whose religious traditions celebrated life, fertility, and the ongoing renewal of the world. The Spanish obsession with individual salvation made little sense to cultures that understood spiritual development as a community endeavor extending across generations. The breakdown in communication accelerated as Spanish colonization intensified. Indigenous children were removed from their families and educated in Spanish schools, where they were beaten for speaking their native languages. Within a single generation, communities lost their ability to pass on traditional knowledge through oral traditions that had been maintained for thousands of years. Elders who held the complex knowledge of astronomy, medicine, history, and religious practice found themselves unable to communicate with their own grandchildren. Spanish administrators, meanwhile, struggled to govern populations they could not understand. They imposed European legal systems on communities that operated according to completely different principles of justice and social organization. They appointed indigenous leaders who could speak Spanish rather than those who had traditional authority, creating conflicts within communities that had previously maintained internal harmony for centuries. The forced conversion to Christianity created its own linguistic chaos. Indigenous peoples were required to confess their sins to Spanish priests, but the Spanish language lacked words for many indigenous spiritual concepts. Confession became a halting, incomplete process where indigenous peoples attempted to translate their entire cosmological understanding into categories that made no sense to them. Spanish priests, frustrated by what they saw as resistance or simple-mindedness, often resorted to harsh punishments for religious infractions they themselves could not clearly explain. Trade relationships, which had connected diverse indigenous communities across vast distances, began to break down as Spanish administrators imposed their own systems of exchange. Markets that had operated for centuries, according to complex protocols of reciprocity and seasonal timing, were reorganized around Spanish concepts of profit and efficiency. Indigenous merchants who had maintained trade relationships spanning generations found themselves unable to communicate with Spanish officials who controlled access to routes and resources. The Spanish legal system created another layer of confusion. Indigenous peoples were required to present their grievances through Spanish courts, using Spanish legal concepts and procedures that bore no relationship to traditional methods of resolving disputes. Cases that might have been settled in days, through community discussion, dragged on for years in Spanish courts, where indigenous plaintiffs struggled to explain concepts of communal ownership, traditional rights, and ancestral obligations that had no equivalent in European law. Even simple daily interactions became fraught with misunderstanding. Spanish colonists expected indigenous peoples to behave according to European standards of deference and respect, but these behaviors often contradicted indigenous protocols for interaction between different social groups. Indigenous peoples, who maintained traditional forms of greeting, gift-giving, and social interaction, were seen as defiant or primitive, while those who adopted Spanish customs were often viewed with suspicion by their own communities. As the decades passed, new generations grew up speaking neither their ancestral languages fluently nor Spanish perfectly. They inhabited a linguistic limbo where complete communication was impossible in any language. Stories, songs, and ceremonies that had preserved cultural knowledge for millennia were gradually forgotten or transformed beyond recognition. The rich oral traditions that had connected indigenous peoples to their history and their land slowly faded into silence. The Spanish, confident in the superiority of their own culture, rarely bothered to learn indigenous languages beyond the minimum necessary for basic communication. They assumed that indigenous peoples would eventually abandon their primitive tongues in favor of the obviously superior Spanish language. What they didn't understand was that language carries within it entire ways of understanding the world. When languages died, worldviews died with them, leaving behind populations disconnected from their own cultural foundations. By the end of the 16th century, the linguistic landscape of the Americas had been fundamentally transformed. Hundreds of indigenous languages had disappeared entirely, taking with them irreplaceable knowledge of medicine, astronomy, agriculture, and philosophy. The survivors spoke Spanish with accents that marked them as conquered peoples, while their children often grew up unable to communicate with their own grandparents. The rich linguistic diversity that had characterized the Americas for thousands of years was being replaced by the linguistic uniformity that Spanish administrators believed would create a more manageable colonial society. Allow yourself to drift deeper into the past, to a time when the morning air in the valleys of Mexico carried the sound of church bells alongside the ancient drums that had called people to prayer for countless generations. Picture yourself in a Spanish mission compound in the year 1540, where adobe walls enclosed a world of profound contradictions. On one side of the courtyard, Franciscan friars knelt in prayer before a simple wooden cross, their brown robes rustling in the dawn breeze. On the other side, indigenous converts gathered hesitantly, their faces bearing the complex expressions of people caught between worlds they could neither fully embrace nor completely abandon. The Spanish conquest was never simply a military campaign. From the very beginning, it was conceived as a holy war, a crusade to bring Christian salvation to heathen lands. Pope Alexander VI had granted the Spanish crown dominion over the New World through papal bulls that explicitly linked territorial conquest with religious conversion. The Spanish saw themselves as instruments of divine will, carrying out God's plan to bring all peoples under the umbrella of Christian civilization. This religious mission gave moral justification to acts of violence and exploitation that might otherwise have troubled Christian consciences. The Spanish missionary enterprise was vast and systematic. Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit priests followed closely behind the conquistadors, establishing missions throughout the Americas. These weren't simply churches, but complete social institutions designed to transform indigenous peoples into Christian subjects of the Spanish crown. The missions combined religious instruction with vocational training, creating communities where indigenous peoples could be gradually weaned from their traditional ways of life and integrated into colonial society. Imagine the daily routine in one of these missions. Indigenous converts rose before dawn to the sound of church bells, a rhythm that replaced the natural timing of sunrise and seasonal cycles that had governed their ancestors' lives for millennia. They gathered for morning prayers conducted in Latin, a language even more foreign than Spanish, repeating words whose meaning they only dimly understood. After prayers came instruction in Christian doctrine, taught through simplified catechisms that reduced complex theological concepts to basic questions and answers that could be memorized without necessarily being comprehended. The missionaries faced an enormous challenge in their efforts to translate Christian concepts into indigenous languages and worldviews. The Christian notion of original sin, for example, had no equivalent in most indigenous cosmologies, which generally viewed humans as fundamentally good beings connected to a sacred natural world. The idea that all people were born corrupted and needed salvation through Christ was not just foreign. It contradicted basic assumptions about human nature that were deeply embedded in indigenous cultures. Similarly, the Christian emphasis on individual salvation clashed with indigenous understandings of spiritual development as a community process. Most indigenous religions were built around collective ceremonies that maintained harmony between human communities and the natural world. The Spanish insistence that each person must develop a personal relationship with Jesus Christ made little Sends to people whose spiritual lives were fundamentally communal. The missionaries developed various strategies to make Christianity more appealing to indigenous populations. They identified similarities between Christian saints and indigenous deities, allowing converts to continue worshiping familiar spiritual figures under new names. They incorporated indigenous musical traditions into Catholic services, creating hybrid forms of worship that combined Christian prayers with indigenous melodies and rhythms. They built churches on the sites of indigenous temples, literally constructing the new religion on the foundations of the old. But this syncretism came at a tremendous cost. Indigenous peoples were forced to abandon or hide many of their most sacred practices. Ceremonies that connected communities to their ancestral lands were forbidden as devil worship. Traditional healing practices were condemned as witchcraft. The complex astronomical knowledge that had guided agricultural cycles for thousands of years was dismissed as primitive superstition. The Spanish Inquisition established offices throughout the Americas to root out what it saw as religious backsliding among indigenous converts. Indigenous peoples who continued to practice traditional ceremonies, even in combination with Christian worship, faced severe punishments. They were publicly whipped, imprisoned, or in extreme cases, executed as heretics. The fear of Inquisition created an atmosphere of suspicion and secrecy that poisoned relationships within indigenous communities. Spanish missionaries also played a crucial role in the destruction of indigenous knowledge systems. They viewed indigenous books and documents as works of the devil and systematically destroyed them. Bishop Diego de Landa famously burned hundreds of Maya codices in the Yucatan, eliminating irreplaceable records of Maya history, astronomy, and religious practice. Similar destruction occurred throughout the Americas as missionaries sought to erase all traces of indigenous intellectual traditions. The missionaries' efforts to impose Christian morality created additional conflicts with indigenous cultural practices. Many indigenous societies had different attitudes toward sexuality, marriage, and family structure than Europeans. Polygamy was common among elite men in many indigenous cultures, but the Spanish insisted on monogamous Christian marriage. Indigenous ceremonies that celebrated fertility and sexuality were condemned as obscene and forbidden. Spanish efforts to impose Christian gender roles also disrupted traditional indigenous social structures. Many indigenous societies had more fluid gender roles than European cultures, with women often playing important roles in religious ceremonies and political decision-making. The Spanish imposed European patriarchal structures that marginalized indigenous women and disrupted traditional patterns of authority and influence. The mission system also served economic and political functions that had little to do with religious conversion. Missions concentrated dispersed indigenous populations into manageable communities where they could be more easily taxed and recruited for labor. The missions themselves became economic enterprises, using indigenous labor to produce goods for colonial markets. Indigenous converts found themselves working long hours in mission workshops and fields, their labor justified as part of their religious education. The Spanish introduced new technologies and crops through the mission system, fundamentally altering indigenous relationships with the land. Indigenous peoples were taught to raise European livestock, grow European crops, and use European tools and techniques. While some of these innovations were genuinely beneficial, they also disrupted ecological systems that had been carefully managed by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. Spanish colonial law created a complex racial hierarchy that classified people according to their ancestry and determined their legal status. Indigenous peoples who converted to Christianity and adopted Spanish customs could potentially improve their social position, but they remained legally inferior to people of European descent. The promise of social advancement through religious conversion proved largely illusory, as colonial society was structured to maintain Spanish dominance regardless of individual achievement or religious devotion. The psychological impact of forced conversion was devastating for many indigenous communities. People who had derived meaning and identity from traditional religious practices found themselves spiritually adrift, unable to return to the old ways, but never fully accepted into the new Christian community. The resulting cultural confusion and identity crisis contributed to social problems including alcoholism, family breakdown, and community conflict that persisted for generations. Some indigenous leaders attempted to resist Spanish religious domination by preserving traditional practices in secret or by creating new syncretic religious movements that combined Christian and indigenous elements. These resistance movements often took on messianic characteristics, with indigenous prophets promising the return of the old gods and the expulsion of the Spanish colonizers. The Spanish authorities responded to these movements with brutal repression, viewing them as both religious heresy and political rebellion. The Spanish missionary enterprise ultimately succeeded in converting millions of indigenous peoples to Christianity, but the Christianity that emerged in the Americas was quite different from European Catholicism. Indigenous converts created their own interpretations of Christian doctrine, often emphasizing elements that resonated with their traditional worldviews while quietly ignoring aspects that seemed foreign or oppressive. This process of creative adaptation allowed many indigenous communities to maintain some connection to their ancestral traditions while appearing to conform to Spanish religious requirements. That by the end of the colonial period, the religious landscape of the Americas had been completely transformed. Ancient temples lay in ruins, their stones incorporated into the walls of Christian churches. Traditional ceremonies survived only in remote areas or in carefully disguised forms that could pass for Christian worship. The complex theological and philosophical traditions that had developed over thousands of years in indigenous cultures were reduced to folklore and superstition, dismissed by Spanish intellectuals as primitive curiosities with no serious content. Yet, the Spanish religious conquest was never as complete as its architects intended. Indigenous peoples proved remarkably creative in preserving elements of their traditional spiritual lives within the framework of colonial Christianity. They hid sacred objects in Christian shrines, preserved traditional songs by setting them to Christian melodies, and maintained ancestral burial practices by incorporating them into Christian funeral rites. This quiet resistance ensured that fragments of pre-Columbian spiritual traditions survived into the modern era, though often in forms so transformed that their original meanings were barely recognizable. The legacy of the Spanish religious conquest continues to shape Latin American societies today. The Catholic Church remains a powerful institution throughout the region, but Latin American Catholicism retains distinctive characteristics that reflect its indigenous roots. Popular religious practices often blend Christian and indigenous elements in ways that would have horrified the original Spanish missionaries. The struggle between imposed European religious traditions and indigenous spiritual practices created cultural tensions that persist in many Latin American communities, contributing to ongoing conflicts over identity, authority, and the meaning of modernity itself. Let your mind drift now to a quieter, more insidious form of conquest, one that moved silently through communities like an invisible army, striking down warriors and children alike with democratic efficiency. Picture yourself in a Maya village in the Yucatan Peninsula in the year 1520, 2 years before Spanish soldiers would set foot in this particular community. The morning air carries the familiar sounds of daily life. Women grinding corn on stone metates, children playing in the dusty pathways between thatched houses, men preparing for another day of tending the carefully managed forest gardens that have sustained this community for generations. But something is wrong. In the house at the edge of the village, an old woman lies burning with fever, her skin erupting in painful blisters that no traditional remedy can heal. She contracted this mysterious illness from a trader who passed through 3 weeks ago, a man who had traveled from the coast where strange pale men had recently arrived in floating houses. The trader had seemed healthy when he left, but he carried within his body microscopic passengers that would prove more devastating to indigenous populations than all the Spanish weapons combined. This was smallpox, one of humanity's most successful killers, making its first journey into populations that had never encountered it before. The disease that had plagued old world civilizations for thousands of years was about to unleash itself on societies that had no biological defenses against its ravages. What followed was not conquest in any traditional sense, but biological. Catastrophe on a scale that dwarfs most. Natural disasters in human history. The story of disease in the Americas begins long before Columbus. For thousands of years after the last ice age, the Americas had remained largely isolated from the disease environment that shaped human evolution in Africa, Europe, and Asia, while old world populations were repeatedly exposed to epidemic diseases that jumped from domesticated animals to human host. Smallpox from cattle, influenza from pigs and birds, plague from rodents. Indigenous American populations lived in relative isolation from such pathogens. This isolation had allowed indigenous populations to grow and flourish without the devastating epidemic diseases that regularly swept through old world civilizations. But it also meant that when these diseases finally arrived, they encountered populations with no inherited immunity, no cultural memory of how to respond to epidemic disease, and no understanding of how such illnesses spread from person to person. Smallpox was particularly deadly because it spread through respiratory droplets, meaning that simply being in the same room as an infected person could transmit the disease. In densely populated areas like Tenochtitlan, where thousands of people lived in close quarters, the disease spread with terrifying speed. Within days of the first appearance of symptoms, entire neighborhoods would be affected. Within weeks, the disease would spread throughout the city and into the surrounding countryside. The symptoms of smallpox were horrifying to people who had never seen anything like them. The disease began with high fever, headache, and back pain symptoms that might initially be mistaken for other illnesses. But within a few days, the characteristic rash would appear, starting in the mouth and throat before spreading across the face and then the entire body. The rash developed into fluid-filled blisters that were excruciatingly painful and left deep scars on those fortunate enough to survive. For indigenous healers, smallpox presented an impossible challenge. Their medical traditions, developed over thousands of years, included sophisticated treatments for local diseases and injuries, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for an epidemic disease that seemed to strike randomly and kill with such efficiency. Traditional remedies that worked for familiar ailments proved useless against smallpox. Steam baths, a common treatment for fever in many indigenous cultures, actually made smallpox symptoms worse by encouraging the spread of the virus through the respiratory system. The social impact of smallpox was as devastating as its biological effects. The disease struck so quickly and killed so many people that communities lost their ability to function. When large numbers of adults fell ill simultaneously, there was no one left to care for children, tend crops, or maintain the basic infrastructure of community life. Villages that had thrived for centuries were reduced to ghost towns in a matter of weeks, their survivors fleeing in terror from places that had suddenly become synonymous with death. The psychological impact of epidemic disease was perhaps even more devastating than its physical effects. Indigenous peoples had no framework for understanding how diseases could spread from person to person without any visible cause. Many interpreted the epidemics as supernatural punishment, evidence that their gods had abandoned them, or that the Spanish possessed magical powers beyond human comprehension. This spiritual crisis undermined traditional authority structures and left Communities vulnerable to Spanish religious and political domination. Spanish colonists who had grown up in societies where epidemic diseases were familiar, if feared, realities, initially saw the devastation wrought by smallpox as evidence of divine favor. They interpreted the death of indigenous populations as God's way of clearing the land for Christian settlement. This interpretation allowed them to avoid confronting the moral implications of conquest while simultaneously providing religious justification for taking over indigenous territories. But the Spanish were not entirely immune to the disease environment they had unleashed. While most had some resistance to smallpox due to childhood exposure or genetic inheritance, they remained vulnerable to other diseases. Yellow fever, which thrived in tropical American environments, killed many Spanish colonists. Malaria, typhus, and other tropical diseases took a steady toll on European populations throughout the colonial period. The Spanish response to epidemic disease was quite different from indigenous responses, reflecting centuries of experience with such outbreaks. They understood the importance of quarantine, though their methods were often crude and ineffective. They had some knowledge of variolation, an early form of smallpox inoculation that involved deliberately exposing people to mild cases of the disease to provide immunity. Most importantly, they had cultural mechanisms for coping with epidemic disease that allowed their communities to continue functioning even when significant portions of the population were affected. Indigenous communities, lacking this cultural knowledge, often responded in ways that inadvertently made epidemics worse. When people fell ill, families would gather around them to provide care and comfort, unknowingly facilitating the spread of respiratory diseases. Religious ceremonies meant to appease angry gods brought large numbers of people together in enclosed spaces where diseases could spread rapidly. Traditional migration patterns, designed to take advantage of seasonal resources, became pathways for disease transmission across vast distances. The demographic impact of epidemic diseases in the Americas was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that epidemic diseases killed between 80 and 90% of the indigenous population within the first century of European contact. In some areas, the mortality rate approached 95%, effectively eliminating entire ethnic groups and linguistic communities. These mortality rates exceed those of any natural disaster in recorded human history, including the Black Death that devastated medieval Europe. The diseases came in waves, each one striking populations still recovering from previous epidemics. Smallpox was followed by typhus, then measles, then influenza, then plague, creating a century-long cycle of demographic catastrophe that prevented indigenous populations from recovering their pre-contact numbers. Just as communities began to rebuild after one epidemic, another would arrive to decimate the survivors. Children were particularly vulnerable to epidemic diseases, creating a demographic crisis that extended far beyond the immediate mortality. With each epidemic wave, communities lost not just current population, but future reproductive potential. The knowledge and skills that would normally be passed from generation to generation were lost when entire age cohorts died before they could train their successors. The Spanish documented these demographic catastrophes with bureaucratic precision, conducting regular censuses that tracked the decline of indigenous populations for tax and labor purposes. Their records provide a grim accounting of one of history's greatest demographic disasters. In central Mexico, the indigenous population fell from an estimated 25 million in 1519 to fewer than 2 million by 1600. Similar patterns occurred throughout the Americas, with some regions experiencing even more severe population losses. The ecological consequences of this demographic collapse were equally profound. Indigenous populations had actively managed American ecosystems for thousands of years, using controlled burning, selective harvesting, and sophisticated agricultural techniques to maintain productive landscapes. When these populations disappeared, the landscapes they had created began to revert to wilderness. Forests reclaimed agricultural terraces. Game animals multiplied in the absence of human hunters, and carefully maintained systems of irrigation and soil conservation collapsed. This ecological transformation had global implications. The regrowth of forests in abandoned indigenous territories absorbed so much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that it may have contributed to the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that lasted from the 16th to the 19th centuries. The collision of worlds that began with Columbus had consequences that extended far beyond the Americas, affecting global climate patterns and altering the trajectory of human civilization worldwide. Yet, some indigenous communities did survive the biological catastrophe of epidemic disease. Those who lived in remote areas, who had smaller populations that could practice effective isolation, or who were fortunate enough to avoid the worst epidemic waves, managed to maintain their communities through the darkest period of demographic collapse. These survivors became the ancestors of modern indigenous populations throughout the Americas, carrying forward cultural traditions and genetic heritage that might otherwise have been lost forever. Allow yourself to drift deeper into this history of invisible devastation, to a time when entire civilizations could disappear not through war or natural disaster, but through the inexorable spread of microscopic organisms that recognized no borders, respected no treaties, and showed no mercy to age or status. Picture yourself as an observer in the Inca Empire in the year 1525, 7 years before Francisco Pizarro would arrive to claim this vast realm for Spain. You stand on a terraced mountainside overlooking the sacred valley of the Urubamba, where the morning mist rises from carefully cultivated fields that stretch like green steps toward the snow-capped peaks of the Andes. The Inca Empire at this moment represents the culmination of thousands of years of Andean civilization. From your vantage point, you can see the perfectly fitted stone walls of agricultural terraces, the sophisticated canal systems that carry water from mountain glaciers to valley floors, and the broad highways that connect this valley to an empire stretching from present-day Colombia to central Chile. This is Tawantinsuyu, the land of the Four Quarters, home to perhaps 12 million people living in one of the most sophisticated civilizations a world has ever known. But even as you watch this scene of apparent prosperity and order, the Inca Empire is already dying. Smallpox has arrived in the coastal regions, carried by traders and messengers, traveling the very road system that represents the empire's greatest achievement. The disease is spreading along the highways and mountain paths with the efficiency of the Inca postal system, moving faster than any human messenger could travel, racing ahead of the Spanish conquistadors, who will eventually claim credit for destroying this empire. The Inca Emperor Huayna Capac has been dead for 3 years, killed by smallpox in what is now Ecuador. His death has triggered a succession crisis between his sons Huascar and Atahualpa, but this civil war is only a secondary consequence of the real catastrophe unfolding throughout the empire. While the brothers fight for control of Tawantinsuyu, the empire itself is being hollowed out by epidemic disease that strikes with democratic impartiality, killing nobles and commoners, priests and farmers, administrators and artisans with equal efficiency. The demographic collapse unfolding in the Andes represents one of the most complete cultural extinctions in human history. The Inca had developed sophisticated systems of record-keeping using knotted strings called quipu, but these records were maintained by specialists whose knowledge died with them when epidemic diseases struck their communities. Unlike written records that could survive the death of their creators, the quipu system required living human interpreters to decode its complex patterns of knots and colors. Imagine yourself in the administrative center of Cusco, the navel of the Inca world. As the epidemic reaches this sacred city, the stone buildings that have stood for centuries remain intact, but the people who gave them meaning are disappearing with terrifying speed. The Akla, Women chosen for their beauty and skill to serve in religious ceremonies lie dead in the sacred compounds where they once maintained the eternal fires that connected earth to sky. The Amayudas, wise men who preserved the oral traditions that recorded Inca history and philosophy, have taken their irreplaceable knowledge to early graves. The Quipucamayokes, the trained specialists who could read and create the knotted records that administered this vast empire, are dying faster than they can train their successors. Each death represents not just the loss of an individual life, but the destruction of vast stores of information about taxation, population, resource management, and historical events. The sophisticated administrative system that had allowed the Inca to govern millions of people across thousands of miles of difficult terrain was dependent on human memory and specialized knowledge that could not survive the demographic catastrophe of epidemic disease. The Meta system, the carefully calibrated labor tribute that had built the roads, terraces, and cities of the empire, began to collapse as entire communities disappeared. Villages that had contributed specific crafts or agricultural products to the imperial economy simply ceased to exist, leaving gaps in the supply chains that had fed and clothed the population of Tawantinsuyu. The reciprocal obligations that bound communities to the imperial center became meaningless when there were no longer enough people alive to fulfill them. In the Amazon basin, where countless small societies had developed sophisticated adaptations to life in the rainforest, the demographic collapse was equally complete, but even less visible to European observers. These societies, which anthropologists now believe, may have included urban centers of populations in the hundreds of thousands, left fewer traces of their existence. When epidemic diseases reached them, often carried by indigenous traders traveling ancient river routes, entire regional civilizations vanished with minimal European documentation of their existence. The Arawak-speaking peoples of the Greater Antilles experienced perhaps the most complete extinction of any large population group in the Americas. These islands had supported dense populations that European observers initially estimated in the hundreds of thousands. The Taino of Hispaniola had developed complex chiefdoms with sophisticated agricultural systems based on raised fields and forest management. Their society included skilled artisans, astronomers, and poets whose works were preserved in oral traditions that took generations to perfect. Within 50 years of Columbus's arrival, these societies had ceased to exist as functioning entities. The combination of epidemic disease, forced labor, warfare, and cultural disruption had reduced populations that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands to scattered groups of survivors who could no longer maintain their traditional ways of life. The ball courts where communities had gathered for religious ceremonies and social competitions fell silent. The elaborate ceremonial centers where caciques had maintained their reciprocal relationships that bound communities together were abandoned to the jungle. The speed of this demographic collapse defied European understanding of how societies functioned. Spanish colonists arrived expecting to govern large indigenous populations that could provide labor and tribute, only to find empty villages and abandoned agricultural systems. They had to import enslaved Africans to replace the indigenous workforce that had simply disappeared, fundamentally altering the demographic and cultural landscape of the Americas. The psychological impact of witnessing entire peoples vanish was profound for both indigenous survivors and European observers. Indigenous communities that had maintained oral traditions stretching back thousands of years suddenly found themselves unable to remember the names of villages that had existed just decades earlier. Knowledge systems that had required lifetimes to master disappeared when their practitioners died before they could pass on their skills to the next generation. Spanish chroniclers struggled to document societies that were disappearing even as they wrote about them. They often described indigenous customs and beliefs in the past tense, noting that such practices had been common before the epidemics, but were no longer observed. Their accounts provide tantalizing glimpses of cultural richness and complexity. That was being lost faster than it could be recorded. The artistic traditions of indigenous peoples suffered particularly devastating losses. The creation of complex textiles, pottery, metalwork, and stone sculpture required years of training and practice. When master artisans died in epidemic waves, their skills often died with them. Apprentices who might normally have spent decades learning traditional techniques found themselves suddenly responsible for maintaining artistic traditions. They had barely begun to understand that religious and ceremonial knowledge faced similar extinction. Indigenous religions often required specialists who underwent years of training to learn the complex songs, dances, and rituals that maintained cosmic harmony. The death of these specialists didn't just eliminate individuals, it severed the connections between human communities and the sacred forces that indigenous peoples believed governed the universe. The agricultural knowledge that had allowed indigenous peoples to cultivate crops in challenging environments was equally vulnerable to demographic collapse. Sophisticated techniques for managing soil fertility, water resources, and crop rotation had been developed over thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation. When the farmers who possessed this knowledge died in epidemic waves, their fields often reverted to wilderness because their successors lacked the specialized knowledge necessary to maintain productive agriculture. The linguistic diversity of the Americas suffered catastrophic losses during this period. Hundreds of languages that had evolved over thousands of years disappeared when their last speakers died in epidemic waves. With each lost language went unique ways of understanding and describing the world, irreplaceable knowledge about local ecosystems, and oral literatures that had preserved cultural memory for countless generations. Some Spanish observers recognized the magnitude of what was being lost. Bernardino de Sahagin, a Franciscan friar, worked with indigenous informants to document Aztec culture and beliefs, recognizing that he was recording the last memories of a dying civilization. His general history of the things of New Spain provides one of the most complete records of indigenous life before the conquest, but even his exhaustive work could capture only a fraction of the cultural richness that was disappearing. The demographic collapse also had unexpected ecological consequences. Indigenous populations had actively managed American ecosystems for thousands of years, using sophisticated techniques to maintain productive landscapes that supported large populations. When these populations disappeared, they're carefully managed. Environments began to change in unpredictable ways. Species that had been controlled through indigenous hunting and harvesting practices multiplied beyond their historical ranges. Agricultural terraces that had prevented soil erosion for centuries collapsed when there was no longer sufficient labor to maintain them. Regrowth of forests in areas that had been under indigenous cultivation was so extensive that it affected global climate patterns. Recent research suggests that the carbon absorbed by these regrowing forests may have contributed to the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that lasted from the 16th to the 19th centuries. The demographic collapse in the Americas had consequences that extended far beyond the Western Hemisphere, affecting weather patterns and agricultural productivity worldwide. By the end of the 16th century, the demographic map of the Americas had been completely redrawn. Regions that had supported millions of people were virtually empty. Cities that had rivaled European capitals in size and sophistication lay abandoned. Trade networks that had connected diverse societies across thousands of miles had collapsed. The biological and cultural diversity that had characterized the Americas for thousands of years had been reduced to scattered remnant populations, struggling to maintain their identities in a transformed world. Yet even in the midst of this unprecedented catastrophe, some indigenous communities managed to survive and adapt. Those who lived in remote areas that epidemic diseases reached late, if at all, maintained larger populations and more complete cultural traditions. Some groups developed new forms of social organization that allowed them to function with greatly reduced numbers. Others adapted to Spanish colonial systems, while secretly maintaining elements of their traditional ways of life. The survivors of this demographic collapse became the ancestors of modern indigenous populations throughout the Americas. Their persistence, through the darkest period of their people's history, represents one of the most remarkable examples of cultural resilience in human experience. They carried forward genetic heritage, cultural knowledge, and spiritual traditions that connect contemporary indigenous communities to their pre-Columbian ancestors, ensuring that the demographic collapse of the 16th century, devastating as it was, did not represent the complete extinction of indigenous America. Let yourself settle even deeper into this exploration of spiritual crisis, to a time when the very foundations of indigenous cosmology were shaken by forces that seemed to defy all traditional understanding of how the universe operated. Picture yourself in a Cherokee village in the southern Appalachian Mountains in the year 1540, where Hernando de Soto's expedition has just passed through, leaving behind not just the memory of armored men and snorting horses, but invisible passengers that would transform this mountain community beyond. Recognition. The village sits in a valley beside a clear mountain stream, surrounded by the ancient forests that have provided for Cherokee people since time immemorial. The longhouses with their bark walls and thatched roofs blend harmoniously into the landscape, as if they had grown from the earth itself. Smoke rises from cooking fires where women prepare the Three Sisters corn, beans, and squash that have sustained Cherokee communities for countless generations. Children play along the stream banks, while their grandparents work on crafts that connect them to ancestral traditions, stretching back thousands of years. But something fundamental has changed in this seemingly peaceful scene. In the medicine lodge at the center of the village, the most respected shamans and healers are gathered in urgent consultation. They have witnessed something that challenges their deepest understanding of how the world works. People are falling, ill with symptoms unlike anything in their vast store of medical knowledge. The traditional remedies that have healed their people for generations prove powerless against this mysterious affliction that seems to strike without pattern or reason. The Cherokee, like indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, had developed sophisticated medical traditions based on thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation. Their healers understood the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants, knew how to treat injuries and diseases common to their environment, and possessed complex knowledge about the connections between physical health, spiritual well-being, and harmony with the natural world. Their medical practices were not just practical treatments, but sacred ceremonies that restored balance between individuals and the cosmic forces that govern all existence. The appearance of epidemic diseases shattered these carefully constructed systems of understanding. Cherokee medicine was based on the principle that illness resulted from disharmony between individuals and their communities, between communities and the natural world, or between the human realm and the spirit world. Diseases could be caused by breaking taboos, failing to show proper respect to animal spirits, or allowing negative emotions like jealousy or anger to disrupt personal balance. Treatment involved not just physical remedies, but spiritual purification and the restoration of proper relationships. Smallpox and other epidemic diseases did not fit this paradigm. They struck randomly, affecting people who had lived in harmony with traditional ways and ignored those who had violated important taboos. Children who had never had the opportunity to break spiritual laws died alongside elders who had spent lifetimes maintaining sacred relationships. The disease seemed to mock the very foundations of Cherokee understanding about how the universe operated. The shamans gathered in the medicine lodge faced an unprecedented crisis. Their roles in Cherokee society extended far beyond healing individual patients. They were the guardians of cosmic order, responsible for maintaining the delicate balance between the human and spirit worlds. Their ceremonies ensured that the seasons changed properly, that game animals remained plentiful, that crops grew successfully, and that the Cherokee people maintained their proper place in the sacred geography of their homeland as epidemic diseases spread through Cherokee communities. These shamans found themselves confronting evidence that their fundamental understanding of reality might be flawed. The ceremonies that had always restored health proved ineffective. The spirit helpers who had guided their healing work seemed to have abandoned them. The plant medicines that had never failed before could not touch this new form of illness that consumed people from within and left behind disfiguring scars or death. The psychological impact of this spiritual crisis extended far beyond the shamans themselves. Cherokee society, like most indigenous societies, was organized around the principle that human welfare depended on maintaining proper relationships with the spirit world. If the shamans could not heal epidemic diseases, it suggested either that the Cherokee had committed some terrible collective sin that had angered the spirits, or that the spirits themselves had lost their power to protect their human relatives. Some Cherokee shamans interpreted the epidemics as supernatural warfare, evidence that the Europeans possessed spiritual powers that exceeded their own. The Spanish had claimed that their god was more powerful than indigenous deities, and the devastating impact of epidemic diseases seemed to support this claim. If European diseases could kill Cherokee people while leaving Europeans relatively unharmed, perhaps the Christian God really was superior to Cherokee spirits. This interpretation led some Cherokee communities to experiment with Christian prayers and rituals, hoping to access the spiritual power that seemed to protect Europeans from epidemic diseases. Cherokee healers who had spent lifetimes mastering traditional medicine began incorporating Christian elements into their ceremonies, creating hybrid healing practices that combined indigenous and European spiritual traditions that other shamans rejected. Any accommodation with European spirituality, insisting that the epidemics represented a test of Cherokee faith that could only be overcome through stricter adherence to traditional ways. They called for the revival of ancient ceremonies that had not been practiced for generations, hoping to appease spirits who might have been neglected as Cherokee. Communities became involved in trade relationships with Europeans. These different responses to spiritual crisis created divisions within Cherokee communities that persisted long after the immediate threat of epidemic diseases had passed. Traditionalists who insisted on maintaining ancient practices often found themselves in conflict with progressives who believed that adaptation to European ways was necessary for Cherokee survival. These conflicts were not just about practical politics, but about fundamental questions of Cherokee identity and the nature of reality itself. The crisis of confidence in traditional healing practices had practical as well as spiritual consequences. Cherokee communities had always relied on their shamans, not just for medical treatment, but for guidance in all aspects of life. When shamans lost confidence in their ability to heal epidemic diseases, their authority in other areas was also undermined. Young people began to question traditional teachings about proper behavior, seasonal ceremonies, and relationships with the natural world. The breakdown of traditional medical authority created opportunities for European healers and missionaries to establish influence in Cherokee communities. Spanish and later English colonial officials often brought physicians or missionary healers who claimed superior knowledge of treating epidemic diseases. While European medical knowledge was actually quite limited and often ineffective, European healers had psychological advantages in dealing with diseases that were familiar to them even if they could not cure them. Cherokee communities that had maintained their independence for centuries found themselves increasingly dependent on European medical assistance. This dependence extended beyond immediate health care to broader questions about how Cherokee people should live in a world where traditional knowledge seemed inadequate to ensure survival. The spiritual crisis triggered by epidemic diseases became a pathway for European cultural and political influence that extended far beyond the immediate medical emergency. The impact on Cherokee women was particularly devastating, as they had traditionally played central roles in healing and maintaining community health. Cherokee society recognized numerous female healers and spiritual leaders who possessed specialized knowledge about childbirth, women's health, and the medicinal properties of plants. The failure of traditional healing practices to address epidemic diseases undermined these women's status and authority within their communities. Cherokee children growing up during the epidemic period often developed fundamentally different relationships to traditional healing practices than their parents and grandparents. Having witnessed the failure of traditional medicine to protect their communities from epidemic diseases, many young Cherokee people became skeptical of all indigenous healing practices, even those that remained effective for treating non-epidemic illnesses. This generational divide contributed to the gradual erosion of traditional medical knowledge, even after the immediate crisis of epidemic diseases had passed. The Cherokee response to epidemic diseases also reflected their sophisticated understanding of community health and social organization. Unlike European societies, which often dealt with epidemic diseases through individual treatment and quarantine measures, Cherokee communities emphasized collective responses that addressed the spiritual and social dimensions of illness. Cherokee healing ceremonies typically involved entire communities in elaborate rituals designed to restore cosmic harmony and communal well-being. These collective healing practices, while spiritually meaningful to Cherokee participants, often inadvertently facilitated the spread of epidemic diseases by bringing large numbers of people together in enclosed spaces where respiratory diseases could spread rapidly. The Cherokee emphasis on community support for sick individuals also meant that extended families often gathered around epidemic victims, unknowingly exposing themselves to deadly pathogens. The gradual recognition that traditional healing practices might actually contribute to the spread of epidemic diseases created another layer of spiritual crisis for Cherokee shamans. Practices that had always been understood as promoting health and community well-being were revealed to have deadly consequences under the new conditions created by epidemic diseases. This realization forced Cherokee healers to question not just specific remedies, but the fundamental principles underlying their entire medical tradition. Some Cherokee shamans developed new healing practices specifically designed to address epidemic diseases while minimizing the risk of community transmission. These innovations often involved treating patients in isolation, using spiritual rather than physical interventions, and modifying traditional ceremonies to reduce physical contact between participants. While these adaptations showed the flexibility and creativity of Cherokee healing traditions, they also represented fundamental departures from practices that had been considered sacred and uncangeable that the long-term impact of the epidemic crisis on Cherokee's spiritual life was profound and lasting. Traditional healing practices never fully recovered their former authority, even after Cherokee communities developed some resistance to epidemic diseases through exposure and genetic selection. The spiritual confidence that had sustained Cherokee culture for thousands of years was permanently shaken by the confrontation with diseases that seemed to demonstrate the limitations of indigenous knowledge and the superior power of European spirituality. Cherokee shamans also demonstrated remarkable resilience and creativity in adapting their spiritual practices to new circumstances. They developed new ceremonies that addressed the trauma of epidemic loss, created hybrid healing practices that incorporated useful elements from European medicine while maintaining Cherokee spiritual frameworks, and preserved core elements of traditional healing knowledge that remained relevant for treating non-epidemic illnesses. The Cherokee experience with epidemic diseases illustrates the broader spiritual crisis that affected indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. The failure of traditional healing practices to address epidemic diseases undermined indigenous confidence in their entire cosmological understanding, creating opportunities for European, cultural, and religious influence that extended far beyond the immediate medical emergency. Yet indigenous communities also showed remarkable creativity in adapting their spiritual traditions to new circumstances, ensuring that core elements of their religious heritage survived even through the darkest periods of demographic and cultural crisis. This spiritual transformation had lasting consequences for the development of indigenous Christianity throughout the Americas. Indigenous peoples who converted to Christianity often brought with them theological perspectives shaped by their experience of epidemic diseases and the apparent failure of traditional spiritual practices. Their Christianity incorporated elements from indigenous traditions, while also reflecting their understanding that European spirituality possessed powers that indigenous traditions lacked, the epidemic diseases that devastated indigenous populations in the Americas thus represented not just biological and demographic catastrophes, but spiritual crises that fundamentally altered indigenous understanding of their place in the cosmos. The shamans who gathered in medicine lodges to confront these unprecedented challenges were not just trying to heal individual patients, but struggling to maintain their people's spiritual connections to a universe that seemed to have been turned upside down by forces beyond their understanding or control. Allow your consciousness to drift now toward one of history's most tragic urban transformations, settling your awareness over the great island city of Tenochtitlan in the year 1521. Picture yourself floating above the vast expanse of Lake Texcoco as dawn breaks over the Valley of Mexico, illuminating what had been just months before one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the world. A morning light reveals a scene that would have been unimaginable to the 200,000 people who had called this place home at the height of Aztec power. Where once the geometrically perfect canals had reflected the rising sun like ribbons of gold, threading through the urban landscape, now the water runs dark with smoke and debris. The carefully tended floating gardens that had fed the great metropolis float abandoned, their precise rows of vegetables withering in the morning heat. The great causeways that had connected the island city to the mainland engineering marvels that had impressed even the Spanish conquistadors now serve as pathways for retreat rather than arteries of commerce and pilgrimage. Tenochtitlan had been the heart of an empire, but more than that, it had been a living embodiment of Aztec understanding, of cosmic order. Every street, every temple, every building had been positioned according to careful astronomical calculations and religious principles that connected the earthly city to the movements of celestial bodies and the sacred geography of the Aztec universe. The Templo Mayor, the great pyramid that dominated the city center, aligned precisely with the cardinal directions and marked the spot where the Aztecs believed their world had been created. The Spanish siege of Tenochtitlan, led by Hernan Cortes, had lasted 75 days and represented one of the most complete urban destructions in human history. But the siege itself was only the final act in a longer drama of cultural and biological catastrophe that had been unfolding since the Spanish first arrived in the Valley of Mexico. Smallpox had reached Tenochtitlan before Cortes returned from his confrontation with Panfilo de Narvaez, killing perhaps a third of the city's population and fundamentally altering the balance of power between the Spanish and their indigenous opponents. The death of Moctezuma II during the Spanish occupation of the city had created a succession crisis that weakened Aztec resistance at precisely the moment when strong leadership was most needed. His successor, Cuitlahuac, had led the successful expulsion of the Spanish during what the conquistadors called La Noche Triste, but he died of smallpox just 80 days after taking power. The third and final Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was a young man who inherited an empire already devastated by disease and facing enemies, who possessed overwhelming technological advantages. As you observe this final siege from your imagined vantage point above the lake, notice how the very elements that had made Tenochtitlan impregnable for centuries now worked against its defenders. The island location that had protected the city from land-based attacks became a trap when the Spanish-built brigantines, shallow draft sailing vessels that could control the lake and cut off the city's supply lines. The causeways that had connected the city to the mainland could be destroyed to prevent Spanish attack, but their destruction also prevented the escape of civilians and the resupply of defenders. The Spanish strategy was not simply military, but ecological. They recognized that Tenochtitlan depended entirely on its lake environment for fresh water, transportation, and food production. By controlling the lake with their ships and destroying the aqueducts that brought fresh water from the mainland, they could force the city's surrender without having to assault its massive stone fortifications directly. It was a siege strategy that attacked the urban ecosystem rather than just the urban population. Inside the city, the effects of this ecological warfare were devastating. The fresh water that had sustained 200,000 people was cut off, forcing defenders to drink the brackish lake water that made up most of Lake Texcoco. Without access to the chinampas, the floating gardens that had provided fresh vegetables, and with supply lines from the mainland severed, the city's food reserves were quickly exhausted. A sophisticated urban infrastructure that had made Tenochtitlan one of the world's most successful cities became useless without the ecological connections that had sustained it. The Spanish accounts of the siege, written by participants like Bernal Diaz del Castillo and Cortes himself, provide detailed descriptions of the city's gradual collapse. They wrote about streets littered with bodies that no one had the strength to bury, about the overwhelming stench of death that hung over the city like a physical presence, about desperate defenders who continued to fight even as they starved and died of thirst. These accounts, while clearly biased in favor of Spanish perspectives, nonetheless convey something of the magnitude of urban catastrophe that unfolded during those 75 days. The indigenous perspective on the siege is preserved in texts like the Florentine Codex, compiled after the Conquest by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagun, working with indigenous informants. These sources provide a different view of the siege, emphasizing the spiritual as well as physical dimensions of the city's destruction. For the Aztecs, the fall of Tenochtitlan represented not just military defeat, but cosmic catastrophe. End of the fifth sun, the current era of world history that Aztec prophecy had predicted would end in destruction. The final assault on the city began in early August 1521, when Spanish forces and their indigenous allies broke through the last defensive positions and began the systematic destruction of Tenochtitlan's urban infrastructure. What followed was not just conquest, but deliberate urban demolition designed to erase all traces of Aztec civilization from the Valley of Mexico. Spanish soldiers worked methodically to tear down temples, palaces, and public buildings, using indigenous forced labor to dismantle the city that had taken centuries to build. Destruction was both practical and symbolic. The Spanish needed building materials for their own colonial capital, and the stones of Tenochtitlan provided a convenient source of already quarried and shaped construction material. But the demolition also served ideological purposes, eliminating the physical reminders of Aztec power and religious practice that might inspire resistance to Spanish rule. The Templo Mayor, the spiritual center of the Aztec universe, was completely destroyed, and its stones used to build the foundation of the Catholic cathedral that would rise on the same site. The human cost of this urban destruction was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that 240,000 people died during the siege itself, but the long-term demographic impact was even greater. The survivors were dispersed to other parts of the Valley of Mexico or forced to work as laborers in Spanish. Construction projects. The urban concentration that had supported specialized artisans, scholars, priests, and administrators was broken up, leading to the rapid loss of technical and cultural knowledge that had taken generations to accumulate. The ecological destruction was equally complete. The Chinampa system that had made the Valley of Mexico one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world was abandoned as Spanish colonists showed little interest in maintaining the complex hydraulic infrastructure required to keep the floating gardens productive. The careful water management systems that had prevented flooding and soil salinization were allowed to deteriorate, leading to environmental problems that persisted well into the modern era. The Spanish built their new capital, which they called Mexico City, directly on top of the ruins of Tenochtitlan. But the colonial city was organized according to completely different principles than its Aztec predecessor. Where Tenochtitlan had been designed as a sacred space that reflected cosmic order and maintained harmony with the lake environment, Mexico City was planned as a European-style administrative center that prioritized the needs of Spanish colonists over ecological sustainability or indigenous cultural values. The transformation of Tenochtitlan into Mexico City represents one of history's most complete examples of urban cultural replacement. Within a few decades, virtually all traces of the great Aztec capital had disappeared beneath the grid of Spanish colonial streets. The elaborate system of canals was filled in and replaced with roads suitable for wheeled vehicles and horses. The markets where goods from throughout Mesoamerica had once been traded were replaced with Spanish-style plazas surrounded by European-style buildings. Yet the destruction was never entirely complete. Archaeological excavations in modern Mexico City continued to reveal fragments of Tenochtitlan's urban infrastructure buried beneath centuries of colonial and modern construction. The discovery of the Templo Mayor in 1978 provided dramatic evidence that the great Aztec capital still exists beneath the modern city, preserved like a fossil of a vanished civilization, waiting to tell its story to future generations. The indigenous survivors of Tenochtitlan's destruction carried memories of their lost city with them into the colonial period, preserving oral traditions and creating written accounts that documented the urban glory that had been destroyed by Spanish conquest. These sources provide invaluable insights into how Aztec society actually functioned and help modern scholars understand the magnitude of what was lost when Tenochtitlan fell. The fall of Tenochtitlan had consequences that extended far beyond the Valley of Mexico. As the largest and most powerful city in Mesoamerica, Tenochtitlan had been the center of trade networks, political alliances, and cultural exchange that connected diverse societies across thousands of miles. Its destruction disrupted these connections and contributed to the broader collapse of indigenous civilization throughout the region. The Spanish recognized the symbolic importance of Tenochtitlan's destruction and used it as a powerful tool of psychological warfare against other indigenous societies. The news that the great Aztec capital had fallen to Spanish arms spread rapidly throughout the Americas, often reaching indigenous communities before Spanish soldiers did. This news contributed to the demoralization and surrender of societies that might otherwise have mounted more effective resistance to Spanish conquest. The urban planning principles that had made Tenochtitlan one of the world's most successful cities were largely ignored by Spanish colonists, who preferred to impose European urban models regardless of their suitability to local environmental conditions. This decision had long-term consequences for the development of Mexico City, which has struggled throughout its history with problems of flooding, subsidence, and water supply that were unknown when the same site supported the thriving city of Tenochtitlan. The destruction of Tenochtitlan thus represents more than just the fall of a city. It symbolizes the broader destruction of indigenous urban civilization throughout the Americas. The Spanish conquest eliminated not just individual cities, but entire urban traditions that had developed sophisticated solutions to the challenges of creating sustainable, high-density settlements in diverse environmental conditions. The knowledge and techniques that had made cities like Tenochtitlan possible were lost, leaving behind urban environments that were often less well adapted to their natural settings than their indigenous predecessors. Let yourself drift deeper into this meditation on the systematic destruction of indigenous treasures, moving your awareness to the highland city of Cusco in the year 1533. Picture yourself standing in the Coricancha, the temple of the sun that served as the most sacred space in the Inca Empire. The walls around you are covered with sheets of pure gold that catch and reflect the morning light, creating an otherworldly glow that transforms the entire space into what the Inca understood as a literal dwelling place of the sun god Inti. The air carries the subtle fragrance of burning coca leaves and other sacred offerings, while the soft voices of priests chant prayers that have echoed in this space for generations. This temple complex represents the pinnacle of Inca artistic and architectural achievement. But more than that, it embodies their understanding of the relationship between the divine, the natural world, and human society. The gold that covers these walls is not mere decoration, but a sacred material that the Inca called the sweat of the sun. In Inca cosmology, gold was not a commodity to be hoarded or traded, but a sacred substance that connected the earthly realm to celestial forces. The careful arrangement of golden objects in the Coricancha maintained cosmic harmony and ensured the continued benevolence of the gods toward the Inca people. The garden adjacent to the temple contains perhaps the most extraordinary collection of golden artifacts ever assembled by human hands. Life-sized golden representations of corn plants, complete with golden ears and silk-like tassels. Golden llamas so realistic they seem ready to move. Golden flowers and butterflies that capture the essence of the natural world in imperishable metal. Trees with golden leaves and silver bark that shimmer in the highland sunshine. This is not merely artistic display, but sacred theater, a tangible representation of the Inca, understanding that the divine essence permeates all aspects of the natural world. The Spanish conquistadors who first entered this sacred space saw something entirely different. Where the Inca saw a divine presence made manifest in precious metal, the Spanish saw the largest treasure hoard in human history. Francisco Pizarro and his men, fresh from their successful ambush and capture of the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, viewed the contents of the Coricancha not as sacred objects, but as raw material to be melted down and converted into portable wealth that could be shipped back to Spain. The systematic looting of the Coricancha began within days of the Spanish occupation of Cusco. Spanish soldiers worked methodically to strip the golden sheets from the temple walls, prying loose metal that had been fitted with such precision that no mortar had been necessary to hold it in place. The life-sized golden corn plants were broken apart and thrown into melting pots, along with golden animals, ceremonial vessels, and religious ornaments that had taken master craftsmen years to create. The Spanish had brought with them portable furnaces specifically designed for melting precious metals, evidence that the systematic looting of indigenous treasures had been planned from the beginning of their expedition. These furnaces worked day and night, consuming artistic masterpieces and reducing them to standardized ingots that could be easily transported and divided among the conquistadors. The sweet smoke that rose from these fires carried with it not just vaporized gold, but the essence of a civilization's most sacred, artistic traditions. Imagine yourself witnessing this transformation as an invisible observer, feeling the profound violation that indigenous peoples experienced as they watched their most sacred spaces being systematically desecrated. The Inca understood gold as a living substance connected to the life force of the sun itself. To melt down golden religious objects was not just theft, but sacrilege and attack on the cosmic order that maintained harmony between heaven and earth. The Spanish justified this destruction through their own religious framework, viewing indigenous treasures as evidence of devil worship that needed to be eliminated in the name of Christian salvation. They saw no artistic or religious value in objects created by people they considered heathens and primitives. The sophisticated metallurgy, the refined artistic sensibility, the complex theological concepts embodied in these treasures, all of this was invisible to conquistadors, who could see only monetary value in precious metals. The scale of this treasure was staggering by any measure. The ransom paid for Atahualpa's life, though the Spanish executed him anyway, filled a room 22 feet long, 17 feet wide, and 8 feet high with golden objects. This represented only a small fraction of the treasure stored in temples, palaces, and sacred sites throughout the Inca Empire. Modern estimates suggest that the Spanish melted down more than 180 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver during their conquest of the Inca Empire, representing the largest transfer of precious metals in human history. But the destruction extended far beyond precious metals. Spanish conquistadors and their indigenous allies systematically ransacked temples throughout the Inca Empire, destroying religious objects made from less valuable materials that nonetheless held immense cultural and spiritual significance. Elaborate textiles that had taken years to weave were cut up and used as common cloth. Intricate wooden carvings were burned as fuel. Ceremonial vessels made from pottery or bronze were smashed and discarded. The Spanish were particularly zealous in destroying objects they recognized as having religious significance. Mummies of Inca rulers, which had been preserved with sophisticated techniques and maintained in positions of honor within temples, were burned as idolatrous objects. The destruction of these mummies was devastating to Inca society, as they represented not just deceased individuals, but continuing spiritual presences that guided and protected their descendants. Sacred huacas, natural and constructed features of the landscape that the Inca considered to be dwelling places of spiritual forces were systematically destroyed or desecrated. Spanish soldiers toppled carefully balanced stone formations that had been venerated for centuries, destroyed mountain shrines that connected communities to their ancestral territories, and built Catholic churches directly on top of sacred sites. To prevent their continued use for indigenous religious practices, the looting was not limited to major urban centers, but extended to every corner of the Inca Empire. Spanish expeditions followed ancient roads into remote valleys, guided by captured indigenous leaders who were tortured until they revealed the locations of hidden treasures. Local communities that had maintained small shrines and ceremonial objects for generations watched helplessly as Spanish soldiers confiscated or destroyed sacred items that connected them to their ancestral heritage. The Spanish also destroyed the sophisticated record-keeping systems that had allowed the Inca to administer their vast empire. The quipu complex arrangements of knotted strings that encoded numerical and historical information were viewed as diabolic objects and systematically burned. The Spanish could not read these records and showed no interest in learning how they functioned, preferring to eliminate them rather than risk their continued use for indigenous resistance activities. The destruction of Inca libraries and archives represented one of the greatest intellectual catastrophes in human history. These collections contained not just administrative records, but historical accounts, religious texts, astronomical observations, and technical knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries. The burning of the quipu libraries eliminated irreplaceable information about Inca engineering, agriculture, medicine, and philosophy that could have provided invaluable insights into one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations. Spanish colonial administrators, who arrived after the initial conquest period, sometimes recognized the magnitude of what had been lost. Pedro de Ciza de Leon, who traveled throughout the former Inca Empire in the 1540s, wrote detailed descriptions of ruined temples and looted treasures, noting that many sites that had been architectural marvels just decades earlier had been reduced to piles of rubble by Spanish treasure hunters. The ecological impact of Spanish mining operations was equally devastating. The extraction of silver from Potosi, which became the largest source of precious metals in the Spanish Empire, required the forced labor of hundreds of thousands of indigenous workers. The mercury used in silver processing poisoned workers and contaminated the surrounding landscape. The deforestation required to fuel mining operations altered entire ecosystems throughout the Andes. The Spanish colonial government attempted to regulate the extraction of precious metals through various legal mechanisms, but enforcement was difficult in remote mining regions where individual conquistadors operated with virtual autonomy. Much of the treasure that reached Spain was officially registered and taxed, but significant quantities were smuggled out of the Americas without official documentation, making it impossible to calculate the true scale of the wealth transfer. The influx of American precious metals into Europe had profound economic consequences that extended far beyond Spain. The sudden increase in the supply of gold and silver contributed to inflation throughout Europe and altered global trade patterns. The wealth extracted from the Americas financed Spanish military campaigns, funded the construction of elaborate palaces and churches, and supported a lifestyle of unprecedented luxury for Spanish nobles and clergy. Yet very little of this wealth remained in the Americas or benefited the indigenous populations who had created the original treasures. Spanish colonial policy was designed to extract maximum wealth from the Americas while investing as little as possible in colonial infrastructure or indigenous welfare. The regions that had produced the world's largest concentrations of precious metals often remained impoverished throughout the colonial period and beyond. The cultural impact of this systematic treasure destruction extended far beyond the immediate loss of valuable objects. Indigenous artisans who had spent lifetimes mastering the techniques of goldworking, silversmithing, and other specialized crafts found their skills suddenly worthless in the colonial economy. The knowledge and techniques that had been passed down through generations of master craftsmen were lost as indigenous communities were forced to abandon traditional artistic practices in favor of European-style crafts that served colonial markets. Spanish introduced their own artistic traditions to replace the indigenous traditions they had destroyed. But these European styles were ill-suited to American materials and environmental conditions. Colonial art and architecture often appeared provincial and derivative compared to the sophisticated indigenous traditions they had replaced. The artistic heritage that emerged from the colonial period represented a dramatic decline in technical skill and creative innovation compared to pre-Columbian achievements. Religious art suffered particularly severe losses, as Spanish missionaries systematically destroyed indigenous religious objects while creating new Christian art that served evangelical purposes. The complex theological and philosophical concepts embodied in indigenous religious art were replaced by simplified Christian imagery designed to communicate basic religious messages to converted populations. The intellectual sophistication and artistic refinement of pre-Columbian religious art was never recovered in the colonial or modern periods. The destruction of indigenous treasures also eliminated important sources of historical information about pre-Columbian civilizations. Many golden and silver objects contained decorative elements that depicted historical events, religious ceremonies, and daily life activities that could have provided invaluable insights into how these societies actually functioned. The systematic melting down of these objects eliminated irreplaceable documentary evidence about American civilizations that had no written languages. Modern archaeological investigations continue to reveal the magnitude of what was lost during the Spanish conquest. Excavations of looted sites show evidence of artistic and technical achievements that far exceeded what Spanish chroniclers described in their accounts of indigenous societies. These discoveries suggest that the Spanish systematically underestimated the sophistication of indigenous civilizations, partly because they had destroyed so much evidence of indigenous achievement before scholars could study it systematically. Legacy of this systematic cultural destruction continues to affect Latin American societies today. Museums throughout Europe and North America contain indigenous American artifacts that were looted during the colonial period, while the countries where these objects were created often lack comprehensive collections of their own cultural heritage. Efforts to repatriate these artifacts have met with limited success, as legal and political obstacles prevent the return of cultural property to its countries of origin. The destruction of indigenous treasures during the Spanish conquest, thus, represents more than just the loss of valuable objects. It symbolizes the broader cultural catastrophe that accompanied European colonization of the Americas. The systematic elimination of indigenous artistic traditions, religious objects, and historical records impoverished not just indigenous communities, but humanity as a whole, eliminating irreplaceable examples of human creativity and cultural achievement that had taken millennia to develop. Allow your consciousness to settle now into perhaps the most tragic scene of cultural destruction in human history. Drifting back to the Plaza of Mani in the Yucatan Peninsula on July 12, 1562, picture yourself as an invisible witness to an auto da fe that would eliminate more accumulated human knowledge in a single afternoon than most natural disasters destroy in centuries. The morning air carries the scent of tropical flowers and the distant sound of howler monkeys in the forest. But these peaceful sounds will soon be overwhelmed by the crackling of flames, consuming the intellectual heritage of Maya civilization. Bishop Diego de Landa stands before a carefully arranged pyre in the town's central plaza, his Franciscan robes moving gently in the warm breeze as he prepares to commit what he believes to be a righteous act of Christian purification. Around him, Spanish soldiers and indigenous converts who have embraced Christianity watch with expressions ranging from satisfaction to barely concealed horror. The bishop raises his hand to signal the beginning of a ceremony that will erase more than 1,000 years of accumulated Maya knowledge in the space of a few hours. The flames that rise from this pyre will consume 27 hieroglyphic books codices written on bark paper and bound in jaguar skin covers that represent the surviving remnants of what had once been vast Maya libraries. These books contain astronomical calculations of extraordinary precision, historical records spanning centuries, religious texts that explain the complex Maya understanding of cosmic cycles, and technical knowledge about mathematics, medicine, and agricultural techniques that had sustained Maya civilization through periods of both flourishing and decline. Each of these codices represents years or even decades of work by Maya scribes who had dedicated their lives to preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge. The creation of a single book required the careful preparation of bark paper from specific trees, the mixing of natural pigments that would remain stable for centuries, and the mastery of a hieroglyphic writing system so complex that only a small number of specialists in each generation could read and write it fluently. The books burning in Landa's fire contain astronomical tables that accurately predict eclipses, calculate the movements of Venus with precision that would not be matched by European astronomers for centuries, and record observations of celestial phenomena spanning hundreds of years. Maya astronomers had developed a sophisticated understanding of planetary cycles that allowed them to create calendars more accurate than those used in Europe at the time of the conquest. The historical sections of these codices contain records of Maya rulers, accounts of political alliances and conflicts, descriptions of important ceremonies and ritual events, and genealogies that connected contemporary Maya communities to their ancestral heritage. This historical knowledge was not just academic information, but the foundation of Maya political and social organization, providing the legitimacy that rulers needed to govern and the cultural continuity that allowed communities to maintain their identities across generations. The religious texts burning in the plaza contain detailed explanations of Maya cosmology, descriptions of creation myths that explain the origins of the universe and humanity's place within it, instructions for performing rituals that maintain harmony between human communities and supernatural forces, and theological discussions about the nature of divine beings and their relationships to the natural world. This religious knowledge was not merely abstract philosophy, but practical guidance that shaped every aspect of Maya daily life, from agricultural practices to child-rearing techniques. The medical and technical knowledge contained in these books represents centuries of careful observation and experimentation. Maya physicians had developed sophisticated treatments for diseases common in tropical environments, surgical techniques that allowed them to perform complex operations, and pharmaceutical knowledge based on the medicinal properties of hundreds of plant species. Maya engineers had created architectural techniques that allowed them to build massive stone structures without metal tools, hydraulic systems that managed water resources in challenging tropical environments, and agricultural methods that sustained large populations in regions that Europeans would later consider uninhabitable. Bishop Landa justified this massive act of cultural destruction by claiming that the Maya books were superstition and lies of the devil. Like most Spanish missionaries, he could not read Maya hieroglyphs and made no effort to understand the content of the books he was destroying. His interpretation of Maya religion was based on European stereotypes about devil worship rather than any serious investigation of Maya theological concepts. The bishop had become convinced that Maya books were being used to perpetuate idolatrous practices among indigenous converts to Christianity. Spanish missionaries had discovered that many Maya communities were continuing traditional religious practices alongside their newly adopted Christian rituals, creating syncretic religious movements that combined elements from both traditions. Rather than trying to understand these hybrid religious practices, Landa chose to eliminate what he saw as the source of religious contamination: the psychological impact of watching their cultural heritage literally go up in smoke was devastating for the Maya witnesses forced to attend this ceremony. Many of these people had grown up in communities with the ability to read and write. Hieroglyphs was considered one of the highest forms of human achievement. They had been taught that the preservation of written knowledge was a sacred obligation that connected them to their ancestors and ensured the continuation of their civilization. Some of the Maya forced to witness this destruction were themselves literate in the hieroglyphic script and understood exactly what knowledge was being lost. They watched helplessly as astronomical calculations that had taken generations to perfect were reduced to ash, as historical records that preserved the memory of their greatest rulers and most important achievements disappeared into smoke. As religious texts that explained the deepest mysteries of existence became fuel for Spanish fanaticism, the Spanish had also arrested and tortured many Maya nobles and priests during their investigation of continuing indigenous religious practices. More than 4,500 Maya were subjected to various forms of physical punishment, including hanging by the wrists, beating with clubs, and having hot wax dripped on their bodies. 18 Maya died from these tortures, while many others were permanently crippled. The burning of the books was the culmination of this campaign of religious persecution designed to break Maya resistance to Spanish cultural domination. The fire that consumed the Maya codices also eliminated important technical knowledge that could have benefited European colonization efforts. Maya agricultural techniques were often superior to European methods for tropical environments, but this knowledge was lost along with the books that contained it. Maya medical knowledge could have provided treatments for diseases that killed many Spanish colonists, but the systematic destruction of indigenous intellectual traditions prevented any transfer of this potentially life-saving information. The Spanish showed similar disregard for indigenous intellectual achievements throughout the Americas. In Peru, they destroyed quipu libraries that contained detailed historical and administrative records of Inca civilization. In Mexico, they burned Aztec codices that contained sophisticated knowledge about astronomy, medicine, and natural history. Throughout the Americas, Spanish missionaries and administrators systematically eliminated indigenous written traditions wherever they encountered them. This cultural destruction was not accidental, but deliberate policy based on the Spanish belief that indigenous knowledge systems were inherently evil and needed to be completely eliminated before authentic Christian civilization could be established in the Americas. Spanish colonial law prohibited indigenous peoples from possessing traditional books or maintaining schools that taught traditional knowledge, making it illegal for indigenous communities to preserve their own intellectual heritage. The few Maya books that survived this systematic destruction did so only because they were hidden in remote caves or secretly maintained by indigenous families willing to risk severe punishment to preserve fragments of their cultural heritage. Only 4 Maya codices are known to have survived to the present day, providing tantalizing glimpses of the intellectual sophistication that was lost when Landis fires consumed the bulk of Maya written literature. Modern scholars who have studied these surviving Maya books have discovered that Maya intellectual achievements far exceeded what Spanish chroniclers described in their accounts of indigenous civilizations. Maya mathematicians had independently developed the concept of zero and created sophisticated numerical systems. Maya astronomers had calculated the length of the solar year with greater accuracy than European calendars of the same period. Maya engineers had developed architectural techniques that allowed their buildings to survive in tropical environments for more than 1,000 years. The destruction of Maya books also eliminated important information about pre-Columbian American history that could have provided valuable insights into how indigenous civilizations responded to environmental challenges, managed complex societies, and maintained cultural continuity over long periods. The historical records contained in these books could have illuminated the rise and fall of Maya city-states, the development of interregional trade networks, and the sophisticated diplomatic relationships that connected Maya communities across vast distances. The ecological knowledge contained in the destroyed Maya books represented centuries of careful observation about tropical ecosystems that could have been invaluable for sustainable development in the Americas. Maya agriculturalists had developed techniques for managing forest resources that maintained biodiversity while producing food for large populations. This knowledge could have prevented many of the environmental problems that have plagued tropical regions since the colonial period. The linguistic information contained in Maya books was equally irreplaceable. Many of these texts contained examples of classical Maya language that differed significantly from the Maya dialects spoken at the time of Spanish conquest. The loss of these linguistic records made it much more difficult for modern scholars to understand the development of Maya languages and to decipher the hieroglyphic inscriptions found on Maya monuments throughout Mesoamerica. The artistic traditions documented in Maya books also disappeared with their destruction. These texts contained examples of Maya pictorial art, decorative designs, and calligraphic techniques that represented the pinnacle of Mesoamerican artistic achievement. The loss of these artistic models contributed to the decline of indigenous artistic traditions throughout the colonial period, as new generations of Maya artists lacked access to the sophisticated aesthetic principles that had guided their predecessors. The philosophical and high theological knowledge contained in Maya books represented some of the most sophisticated indigenous American thinking about fundamental questions of human existence, the nature of reality, and humanity's relationship to the cosmos. Maya philosophers had developed complex theories about time, causation, and the structure of the universe that were comparable in sophistication to philosophical traditions in other parts of the world. The destruction of these intellectual traditions impoverished not just Maya communities, but human knowledge generally. Bishop Landa later attempted to document some aspects of Maya culture in his Relation de las Cosas de Yucatan, but his account was based on incomplete information gathered after most Maya intellectual traditions had already been destroyed. His description of Maya calendar systems and religious practices, while valuable, represents only a fraction of the knowledge that was lost in the fires he had ordered. The cultural trauma caused by this systematic destruction of Maya intellectual heritage persisted for generations. Maya communities that had maintained continuous literary traditions for more than 1,000 years suddenly found themselves cut off from their own cultural foundations. Children grew up unable to read the hieroglyphic inscriptions on monuments in their own communities, while elders who possessed traditional knowledge found themselves unable to pass it on to future generations. Yet some Maya communities showed remarkable resilience in adapting to this cultural catastrophe. They developed new forms of writing using European alphabets to preserve traditional knowledge in forms that Spanish authorities were less likely to recognize and destroy. They created new oral traditions that preserved historical and religious information in ways that could be transmitted without written texts. They incorporated traditional knowledge into apparently Christian practices, allowing important cultural elements to survive beneath the surface of colonial religious conformity. The destruction of Maya books in the Plaza of Mani thus represents more than just a loss of particular texts. It symbolizes the broader assault on indigenous intellectual traditions that characterized European colonization throughout the Americas. The flames that consumed 1,000 years of Maya learning eliminated irreplaceable knowledge that could have contributed to human understanding of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, agriculture, philosophy, and countless other fields of human knowledge that were lost forever in a few hours of Spanish religious fanaticism. Allow your awareness to drift now from the harsh sunlight of destruction into the softer shadows of resistance, settling into a secluded valley in the Andes of Peru in the year 1580. Picture yourself at the edge of a remote indigenous community, where the evening mist rises from terraced fields that have been cultivated according to ancient methods for more than 1,000 years. The Spanish colonial authorities believe they have successfully converted this community to Christianity and eliminated all traces of traditional Inca religious practices. But appearances can be deceiving in ways that would astonish those who impose their will through force rather than understanding. As twilight settles over the mountain valley, you become aware of subtle sounds that seem to emerge from the earth itself. The gentle rhythm of drums played so softly they might be mistaken for distant thunder, the whispered melodies of flutes that blend with the evening wind, the shuffle of feet moving in patterns that appear to casual observers as nothing more than folk dancing. But you are witnessing something far more significant than simple entertainment. This is cultural preservation disguised as colonial compliance, resistance disguised as acceptance. The dancers moving in the gathering darkness are performing choreography that their ancestors learned centuries before any European had set foot in the Americas. Every step, every gesture, every turn carries within it encoded information about Inca history, religious beliefs, astronomical knowledge, and social organization that Spanish missionaries believe they have successfully eliminated. The Spanish colonists who occasionally witness these performances see harmless native customs that pose no threat to colonial authority, but they are actually observing the continuation of intellectual and spiritual traditions that predate Christianity. In the Americas, by thousands of years, the lead dancer, an elderly woman whose weathered hands speak of decades spent working in Spanish colonial fields, moves with a precision that seems to defy her apparent frailty. Her steps trace geometric patterns on the ground that correspond to Inca astronomical observations. marking the positions of stars and planets that guided agricultural activities in pre-Columbian times. The younger dancers who follow her movements are learning not just choreography, but a sophisticated calendar system that allows this community to maintain traditional planting and harvesting schedules, despite Spanish efforts to impose European agricultural methods. The costumes worn by these dancers carry their own messages of cultural resistance. What appears to Spanish observers as colorful folk dress is actually a complex system of visual communication that preserves information about Inca social organization, regional affiliations, and religious beliefs. The patterns woven into the textiles use traditional Inca color codes that communicate specific information about the dancers' ancestral lineages and their roles within the traditional social structure that officially no longer exists. The music accompanying this dance incorporates rhythms and melodies that preserve oral traditions spanning generations. Songs that appear to Spanish listeners as simple folk music actually contain historical narratives about Inca rulers, religious teachings about the relationship between human communities and natural forces, and technical knowledge about agricultural techniques, astronomical observations, and medical practices. The musicians have learned to embed traditional knowledge within musical structures that Spanish authorities do not recognize as carriers of important cultural information. This pattern of cultural disguise and preservation was repeated throughout the Americas, wherever indigenous communities survived the initial catastrophe of conquest and disease. Unable to practice their traditional religions openly, unable to maintain their traditional educational systems, unable to preserve their cultural knowledge through conventional means, indigenous peoples developed remarkably creative strategies for ensuring that essential elements of their heritage would survive the colonial period. In Mexico, indigenous communities incorporated traditional dance movements into Christian religious festivals, creating hybrid performances that satisfied Spanish missionaries while preserving pre-Columbian ceremonial traditions. The volador ceremony, in which dancers suspended from ropes circle around a tall pole, was reinterpreted as a Christian allegory while maintaining its original function as a ritual that connected communities to cosmic cycles and agricultural timing. Aztec and Maya communities preserved their traditional calendar systems by incorporating them into the Catholic liturgical calendar. Feast days that appeared to celebrate Christian saints actually corresponded to important dates in indigenous agricultural and religious cycles. Indigenous converts learned to time their traditional ceremonies to coincide with Christian holy days, allowing them to maintain ancestral practices while appearing to conform to Spanish religious requirements. The preservation of indigenous languages provided another avenue for cultural resistance. While Spanish colonial law required indigenous children to learn Spanish and often prohibited the use of native languages in public settings, many communities continued to speak their ancestral tongues in private. Parents taught their children traditional stories, songs, and prayers in indigenous languages, ensuring that linguistic connections to pre-Columbian culture would survive even when other forms of cultural expression were suppressed. Indigenous communities also developed sophisticated strategies for preserving traditional ecological knowledge that Spanish colonists either ignored or actively tried to suppress. Medicinal plants that had been used for centuries were cultivated in hidden gardens that appeared to Spanish observers as collections of weeds or decorative flowers. Traditional agricultural techniques were practiced in remote fields where Spanish overseers were unlikely to notice methods that deviated from European farming practices. The preservation of traditional healing practices required particular creativity, as Spanish missionaries and colonial authorities were especially vigilant about eliminating what they saw as witchcraft and devil worship. Indigenous healers learned to disguise traditional remedies as folk medicine that posed no threat to Christian orthodoxy. They incorporated Christian prayers and symbols into healing ceremonies while maintaining the essential elements of traditional practice. They taught their knowledge to apprentices through apparently casual conversations that would not attract the attention of Spanish authorities. Women played particularly important roles in these cultural preservation efforts. As Spanish colonial, society often paid less attention to women's activities than to those of men. Indigenous women maintained traditional textile production techniques that preserved important cultural symbols and communication systems. They taught their daughters traditional songs and stories while appearing to engage in ordinary domestic activities. They continued to prepare traditional foods according to ancestral recipes that maintained connections to agricultural and nutritional knowledge developed over thousands of years. The preservation of traditional governance systems required especially subtle forms of resistance. Indigenous communities that had lost their official autonomy often maintained informal leadership structures based on traditional principles of authority and decision-making. Elders who possessed knowledge of traditional law and social organization continued to resolve disputes and provide guidance to their communities while remaining invisible to Spanish colonial administrators. Religious resistance took many forms throughout the Americas. In some regions, indigenous communities maintained traditional shrines in remote locations where Spanish missionaries were unlikely to discover them. They continued to make offerings to traditional deities while publicly attending Christian services. They developed new forms of syncretic religion that combined Christian and indigenous elements in ways that satisfied Spanish authorities, while preserving essential aspects of traditional spirituality. The preservation of historical memory required perhaps the greatest creativity, as Spanish authorities were particularly determined to eliminate indigenous accounts of pre-Columbian history that might inspire resistance to colonial rule. Indigenous communities developed new forms of oral tradition that preserved historical knowledge within apparently harmless folklore. Traditional historical narratives were transformed into folk tales that could be told openly without arousing Spanish suspicion. Some indigenous intellectuals learned to read and write European languages and used these skills to create new forms of cultural documentation that Spanish authorities were less likely to recognize as subversive. They wrote traditional stories using European alphabets, creating texts that appeared to colonial censors as innocent folk literature while actually preserving sophisticated historical and religious knowledge. The art of cultural camouflage became so sophisticated in some communities that multiple layers of meaning could be embedded within single cultural practices. A religious festival might simultaneously celebrate a Christian saint, commemorate a traditional indigenous ceremony, preserve historical memory about pre-Columbian events, maintain astronomical knowledge about seasonal cycles, and provide education about traditional agricultural techniques. Spanish observers saw only the surface layer of Christian devotion, while community members understood the deeper cultural meanings that connected them to their ancestral heritage. The success of these preservation strategies varied greatly depending on local circumstances. Communities that were located in remote areas where Spanish supervision was minimal often managed to preserve more complete cultural traditions than those located near major colonial centers. Communities that maintained larger populations and stronger internal organization were better able to sustain the complex social networks necessary for effective cultural preservation. The psychological impact of maintaining cultural traditions in secret was profound for indigenous communities. The knowledge that their ancestral heritage was continuing beneath the surface of colonial oppression provided hope and meaning that helped sustain communities through the darkest periods of cultural suppression. The ability to pass traditional knowledge on to their children, even in disguised forms, allowed parents to maintain connections between generations that Spanish colonial policy was designed to sever. Yet this clandestine cultural preservation also came with significant costs. The need to hide traditional practices created psychological stress and social fragmentation within indigenous communities. Children who learned traditional knowledge in secret often grew up confused about their cultural identities, uncertain about which aspects of their heritage they could safely express and which needed to be kept hidden. The constant vigilance required to maintain cultural traditions without attracting Spanish attention consumed enormous amounts of community energy and resources. Elders who might have devoted their time to developing and refining traditional knowledge instead spent their lives teaching younger generations how to preserve existing knowledge while avoiding detection by colonial authorities. The selective preservation of cultural traditions also meant that some aspects of indigenous heritage were inevitably lost even within communities that successfully maintained core elements of their ancestral cultures. Complex knowledge systems that required extensive training and practice often could not be fully preserved when they had to be transmitted through informal, secretive channels rather than formal educational institutions. Despite these challenges, the strategies of cultural preservation developed by indigenous communities during the colonial period proved remarkably effective. Many traditions that Spanish authorities believed they had successfully eliminated actually survived in disguised forms and re-emerged in later centuries when political conditions became more favorable to indigenous cultural expression. The dances, songs, stories, and customs that contemporary indigenous communities maintain often represent unbroken connections to pre-Columbian traditions that survived centuries of colonial suppression through the creativity and determination of people who refuse to let their cultural heritage disappear completely. Let your consciousness drift deeper into the quiet spaces of resistance, settling into a humble adobe house in the highlands of Guatemala in the year 1600. Picture yourself as an invisible observer in a modest room where 3 generations of a Maya family gather each evening as the tropical sun sets behind the volcanic peaks that surround their village. To any Spanish colonial official who might pass by, this appears to be an ordinary indigenous household going about the mundane business of daily life. But you are witnessing something far more significant, the deliberate preservation of linguistic heritage that Spanish authorities believe they have successfully eliminated. The grandmother, her face lined with decades of careful observation and cautious survival, speaks to her grandchildren in whispered Quiche Maya as she guides their small hands in preparing traditional foods that connect them to ancestral agricultural practices. Her words carry more than simple cooking instructions. Embedded within her gentle guidance are complex grammatical structures, sophisticated vocabulary, and cultural concepts that have been preserved in this language for more than 2,000 years. She teaches them the proper Maya words for plants, animals, and natural phenomena that have no exact equivalents in Spanish, ensuring that their understanding of the natural world will remain connected to indigenous ways of seeing and interpreting. Their environment taught the children who listen to their grandmother's whispered instructions are growing up in a world of linguistic complexity that would astonish their Spanish colonial governors. In public settings at church, in the market, when Spanish officials are present, they speak the rudimentary Spanish they have learned in mission schools. But in the privacy of their family home, they are inheriting a linguistic treasure that connects them directly to Maya intellectual traditions that predate European presence in the Americas by millennia. This domestic scene represents one of thousands occurring throughout the Americas during the colonial period, as indigenous families develop sophisticated strategies for maintaining their native languages, despite systematic Spanish efforts to eliminate them. Spanish colonial law required indigenous children to learn Spanish and often prohibited the use of native languages in public settings. Mission schools punished students who spoke indigenous languages, and colonial administrators believed that linguistic assimilation was essential for creating loyal Spanish subjects who would abandon their traditional cultural loyalties. The Spanish assumption that indigenous languages would naturally disappear as communities became more integrated into colonial society proved to be dramatically incorrect. Instead, indigenous peoples developed complex linguistic strategies that allowed them to maintain their native tongues while appearing to comply with Spanish language requirements. They created what social linguists now recognize as sophisticated patterns of code switching, using Spanish in public contexts while preserving indigenous languages for private family and community communication. The preservation of indigenous languages during the colonial period required remarkable determination and creativity. Parents had to teach their children to navigate multiple linguistic worlds without attracting unwanted attention from Spanish authorities. Children learned to speak Spanish fluently, enough to satisfy colonial requirements while maintaining their fluency in ancestral languages that carried cultural knowledge, historical memory, and spiritual traditions that could not be adequately translated into European tongues. Indigenous languages served as repositories for cultural knowledge that Spanish colonists either ignored or actively tried to suppress. Many indigenous languages contain sophisticated vocabularies for describing local ecosystems, agricultural techniques, medicinal plants, and astronomical phenomena that had no equivalents in Spanish. The preservation of these languages meant the preservation of intellectual traditions that had developed over thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation. The linguistic resistance took many forms throughout the Americas. In some regions, indigenous communities developed new writing systems that allowed them to create written records in their native languages using European alphabets. These texts often appeared to Spanish observers as simple religious or historical documents, but they actually preserved complex cultural knowledge that would have been lost if communities had relied solely on oral transmission. The Popol Vuh, the great creation narrative of the Maya, was preserved in this manner by indigenous intellectuals who learned to write Quechua using the Latin alphabet. This text, which contains sophisticated theological and philosophical concepts about the nature of the universe and humanity's place within it, survived the colonial period because its creators disguised it as a Christian allegory that would not threaten Spanish religious authorities. Similar preservation efforts occurred throughout the Americas. In Peru, indigenous intellectuals created written records of Inca history and culture using Spanish orthography to represent Quechua language texts. In Mexico, Nahuatl speakers developed extensive written literatures that preserved Aztec historical traditions, religious knowledge, and technical information about agriculture, medicine, and astronomy. The development of indigenous literacy in European alphabets created new opportunities for cultural preservation that had not existed in pre-Columbian times. Communities that had previously relied entirely on oral tradition could now create permanent records of their cultural knowledge that could be hidden from Spanish authorities and transmitted across generations without depending on the continuous presence of living tradition bearers. Yet the transition from purely oral to partially written cultural transmission also created new challenges for indigenous communities. Traditional knowledge that had been preserved through carefully structured oral performances had to be adapted to written forms that might not capture the full complexity of the original traditions. The rhythm, melody, and performance context that had been integral parts of oral tradition were often lost when cultural knowledge was reduced to written text. The psychological impact of maintaining indigenous languages in secret was profound for both individuals and communities. Parents who taught their children traditional languages in whispered conversations were not just preserving communication tools, but maintaining connections to ancestral identities that Spanish colonial policy was designed to eliminate. Children who grew up speaking indigenous languages at home while using Spanish in public learned to navigate complex cultural identities that reflected the ongoing resistance to colonial assimilation, the preservation of indigenous languages also maintained access to traditional forms of prayer, ceremony, and spiritual practice that could not be adequately expressed in Spanish. Many indigenous religious concepts had no equivalent in European languages, and the loss of native tongues would have meant the loss of spiritual traditions that connected communities to their ancestral understanding of the sacred indigenous. Languages preserved historical narratives that provided alternative perspectives on the conquest and colonization of the Americas. These oral histories, maintained in native languages and passed down through families and communities, often contained detailed accounts of colonial violence, cultural destruction, and indigenous resistance that contradicted official Spanish versions of colonial history. The gendered aspects of linguistic preservation were particularly important in many indigenous communities. Women often played central roles in maintaining native languages because Spanish colonial society paid less attention to women's linguistic practices than to those of men. Mothers teaching their children traditional languages, grandmothers telling stories in indigenous tongues, and women maintaining traditional songs and prayers in native languages, all contributed to linguistic preservation efforts that were less visible to Spanish authorities. The preservation of indigenous languages during the colonial period also maintained access to traditional ecological knowledge that was encoded in sophisticated vocabularies for describing local environments. Many indigenous languages contained hundreds of words for describing different types of plants, animals, weather patterns, and geological features that were crucial for maintaining traditional agricultural and resource management practices. Medical knowledge preserved in indigenous languages was particularly valuable, as many traditional healing practices depended on precise terminology that had no equivalents in Spanish. Indigenous healers who maintained their traditional languages could continue to access pharmaceutical knowledge that had been developed over centuries of careful observation and experimentation with local plant species. The astronomical knowledge preserved in indigenous languages allowed some communities to maintain traditional calendar systems and agricultural timing, despite Spanish efforts to impose European temporal frameworks. Indigenous languages often contained sophisticated vocabularies for describing celestial phenomena and seasonal cycles that were essential for maintaining traditional agricultural practices. The linguistic diversity that existed in the Americas before European contact was staggering, with some estimates suggesting that more than 1,000 different languages were spoken in the Western Hemisphere. The preservation of even a fraction of this linguistic heritage during the colonial period represents one of the most successful forms of cultural resistance in human history. Yet the costs of maintaining indigenous languages in secret were also significant. The psychological stress of hiding fundamental aspects of cultural identity created internal conflicts for individuals and communities. Children who grew up speaking indigenous languages at home but Spanish in public often struggled with questions of cultural authenticity and belonging that affected their emotional and social development. The need to maintain linguistic secrecy also limited opportunities for the continued development and refinement of indigenous languages. Traditional processes of linguistic change and innovation were constrained by the need to avoid attracting Spanish attention, leading to what linguists recognize as linguistic fossilization in some communities, the selective preservation of indigenous languages. Also meant that some linguistic traditions were inevitably lost even within communities that successfully maintained their native tongues. Complex forms of ceremonial language, specialized technical vocabularies, and regional dialectal variations often could not be fully preserved when linguistic transmission had to occur through informal, secretive channels. Despite these challenges, the indigenous communities that successfully maintained their native languages during the colonial period preserved irreplaceable linguistic heritage that continues to enrich human cultural diversity today. Many contemporary indigenous languages in the Americas represent unbroken connections to pre-Columbian linguistic traditions that survived centuries of colonial suppression through the determination and creativity of people who understood that language preservation was essential for maintaining cultural identity and community cohesion. The strategies developed by indigenous communities for maintaining their languages during the colonial period continue to influence contemporary efforts at linguistic revitalization and cultural preservation. The recognition that language preservation requires community-based efforts, intergenerational transmission, and creative adaptation to changing circumstances reflects lessons learned during centuries of linguistic resistance to colonial assimilation pressures. Let your awareness settle now into the deepest shadows of this long history, drifting into the twilight world of colonial Latin America in the year 1650, more than a century after the first Spanish ships appeared on American horizons. Picture yourself in the plaza of a colonial town in the Andes, where the evening light casts long shadows between buildings constructed from stones taken from ancient Inca temples. The architecture around you tells the story of cultural layering. It has created something entirely new, yet haunted by everything that came before. The cathedral that dominates the plaza rises from foundations that once supported the most sacred temple of an Inca city. Its Baroque facade, carved by indigenous artisans who learned European techniques while maintaining ancestral aesthetic sensibilities, depicts Christian saints whose faces bear unmistakably indigenous features. The Virgin Mary wears robes decorated with traditional Andean patterns, while angels play instruments that blend European and pre-Columbian designs. This is neither pure European nor pure indigenous art, but something unprecedented in human history, a colonial hybrid that emerged from the collision and gradual synthesis of two vastly different cultural traditions. The people moving through this plaza represent an equally complex fusion of cultures, identities, and survival strategies. Spanish colonists and their American-born descendants maintain the political and economic power that came with conquest, but they live in a world shaped by indigenous knowledge, labor, and cultural practices that they often fail to fully understand or acknowledge. Indigenous peoples who survived the demographic catastrophe of the 16th century have learned to navigate colonial society while maintaining hidden connections to ancestral traditions that give meaning and structure to their transformed lives. Between these two groups, a new population has emerged that embodies the contradictions and complexities of colonial society. People of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, mestizos, inhabit a social space that exists in neither the indigenous nor the Spanish world, creating new forms of cultural expression that blend elements from both traditions while belonging fully to neither. Their very existence challenges colonial categories that were designed to maintain clear distinctions between conquerors and conquered, civilized and savage, Christian and heathen. African peoples brought to the Americas as enslaved laborers to replace the indigenous populations that had been decimated by disease and exploitation, add another layer of cultural complexity to this colonial world. Their survival strategies often parallel those developed by indigenous communities, maintaining ancestral traditions in secret, adapting cultural practices to colonial constraints, and creating new forms of religious and artistic expression that preserve essential elements of identity while appearing to conform to European requirements. The economic systems that sustain this colonial society depend entirely on indigenous and African knowledge and labor. Yet the official ideology of colonialism denies the value of non-European contributions to American development. Silver mining in Potosi relies on indigenous techniques for extracting and processing ore that far exceed European mining knowledge. Agricultural production throughout the Americas depends on indigenous crops, cultivation methods, and ecological knowledge that Spanish colonists have adopted without acknowledgement or understanding. The urban planning that shapes colonial cities often incorporates indigenous concepts of sacred geography and astronomical alignment. But these influences are rarely recognized by Spanish architects and administrators who believe they are creating purely European urban environments. The result is cities that function according to hybrid principles that reflect the complex cultural negotiations necessary for survival in colonial societies. Religious life in colonial Latin America represents perhaps the most complex fusion of cultural traditions. Official Catholicism dominates public religious expression, but indigenous and African spiritual practices continue beneath the surface of Christian orthodoxy. Saints' feast days coincide with traditional agricultural and astronomical cycles. Christian ceremonies incorporate traditional music, dance, and ceremonial elements that carry pre-Columbian spiritual meanings. Indigenous and African deities find new forms of expression through Christian imagery that allows for the continuation of ancestral spiritual relationships. The emergence of apparitions, like the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico, represents the creative synthesis of indigenous and Christian religious traditions. The image that appeared to the indigenous man Juan Diego in 1531 combined Christian iconography with symbols drawn from Aztec religious traditions, creating a form of religious expression that indigenous peoples could embrace as their own while satisfying Spanish requirements for Christian orthodoxy. These syncretic religious movements spread throughout colonial Latin America, creating new forms of Christianity that were genuinely American rather than simply European Christianity transplanted to American soil. Indigenous and African peoples who had been forced to abandon their traditional religious practices found ways to continue essential spiritual relationships through Christian forms that provided cover for the continuation of ancestral traditions. Artistic traditions that emerged in colonial Latin America similarly reflected complex cultural negotiations between imposed European styles and persistent indigenous aesthetic principles. Indigenous and mestizo artists learned European techniques, but applied them to subjects and themes that reflected American experiences and perspectives. The result was an artistic tradition that was recognizably different from both European and pre-Columbian art, representing something entirely new in human cultural development. Architecture in colonial Latin America incorporated indigenous labor, materials, and construction techniques while following European design principles. Indigenous artisans who built colonial churches, palaces, and public buildings brought traditional knowledge about working with local stone, adapting to seismic conditions, and creating buildings that could survive in American environmental conditions. The colonial buildings that still stand today often owe their durability to indigenous construction techniques that European architects did not fully understand. The development of colonial literature created new forms of written expression that reflected the hybrid cultural experiences of people living between worlds. Indigenous and mestizo writers who learned to read and write in European languages used these skills to preserve traditional knowledge, document colonial experiences, and create new forms of literary expression that had no precedent in either. European or indigenous traditions. Music in colonial Latin America evolved into distinctive regional traditions that blended European, indigenous, and African musical elements in ways that created entirely new aesthetic forms. Traditional instruments were modified to produce new sounds. European musical structures were adapted to accommodate indigenous and African rhythmic patterns, and new forms of musical expression emerged that reflected the complex cultural identities of colonial populations. The Spanish colonial legal system struggled to categorize and control populations that did not fit European assumptions about race, culture, and social organization. The system had cast as a complex hierarchy that attempted to classify people according to their racial ancestry reflected Spanish efforts to maintain social control while acknowledging the reality of widespread cultural and biological mixing that had created population groups that had no equivalence in European society. Yet this legal framework also created opportunities for social mobility and cultural adaptation that had not existed in pre-Columbian societies. Indigenous peoples who learned Spanish, adopted European dress and customs, and converted to Christianity could sometimes improve their social status within colonial society. African peoples who gained their freedom could establish new communities that blended African, indigenous, and European cultural elements in creative ways. The persistence of traditional ecological knowledge throughout the colonial period allowed many communities to maintain sustainable relationships with their environments despite the disruptions caused by European colonization. Indigenous agricultural techniques, medicinal practices, and resource management strategies often proved superior to European methods for American environmental conditions, leading to gradual adoption of indigenous practices by Spanish colonists, who initially dismissed them as primitive. The demographic recovery of indigenous populations during the later colonial period created new opportunities for cultural preservation and revitalization. Communities that had been reduced to tiny remnant populations during the 16th century slowly rebuilt their numbers and began to reclaim elements of traditional culture that had been preserved in hidden forms during the darkest periods of colonial oppression. The economic development of colonial Latin America increasingly depended on the labor and knowledge of people who had been marginalized by official colonial ideology. The wealth that flowed from the Americas to Europe was produced by indigenous miners who understood local geological conditions, African agricultural workers who adapted traditional farming techniques to American conditions, and mestizo artisans who combined European and indigenous technical knowledge to create products that serve both local and international markets. Educational institutions in colonial Latin America gradually began to acknowledge the intellectual contributions of non-European populations, though this recognition remained limited and often grudging. Indigenous nobles who learned to read and write in European languages sometimes gained access to formal education that allowed them to document traditional knowledge and advocate for their communities within colonial legal systems. The development of printing presses in colonial Latin America created new opportunities for preserving and disseminating indigenous knowledge. Books published in indigenous languages allowed for the preservation of traditional knowledge in written forms that could survive the deaths of individual tradition bearers. These publications often disguised traditional knowledge as Christian, religious texts or harmless folklore, allowing for the circulation of cultural information that Spanish authorities might otherwise have suppressed. The emergence of Creole identity among people of European descent born in the Americas created another form of cultural hybridity that reflected the influence of American environments and experiences on European cultural traditions. Creoles often developed strong attachments to American landscapes, foods, customs, and cultural practices while maintaining their identification with European civilization. This cultural ambivalence would eventually contribute to independence movements that sought to create American nations that were neither purely European nor purely indigenous. The long-term consequences of cultural mixing in colonial Latin America created societies that were more culturally complex and diverse than anything that had existed in either Europe or pre-Columbian America. The survival strategies developed by indigenous, African, and mixed populations during the colonial period created new forms of cultural expression that enriched human diversity while representing successful adaptations to the challenges of living. In societies structured by conquest and colonization, the colonial world that emerged from 3 centuries of cultural interaction, conflict, and synthesis was haunted by the ghosts of destroyed civilizations, but also animated by the creative spirit of people who refused to allow cultural destruction to be complete. The indigenous knowledge that survived in hidden forms, the African traditions that found new expressions in American contexts, and the European customs that adapted to American conditions, all contributed to the creation of societies that were genuinely new while remaining connected to ancient roots. This colonial legacy continues to shape Latin American societies today. The cultural hybridity that emerged from the collision of worlds during the Conquest period created foundations for national identities that celebrate mixture and diversity while struggling to overcome the inequalities and injustices that were built into colonial social structures. The ancient ghosts that haunt the New World continue to inspire efforts at cultural recovery and social justice that seek to honor the sacrifices of those who preserved essential elements of human diversity through the darkest periods of cultural destruction and demographic catastrophe. The story of survival and resistance that unfolded in the shadows of colonial Latin America demonstrates the remarkable resilience of human cultures and the creative capacity of people to adapt to even the most challenging circumstances while maintaining connections to ancestral traditions. The new world that emerged from the Conquest was indeed haunted by ancient spirits, but these ghosts were not simply reminders of loss and destruction. They were also guardians of knowledge, wisdom, and cultural practices that continue to enrich human civilization and provide inspiration for contemporary efforts to create more just and sustainable societies. As our journey through this troubled history draws to a close, allow yourself to settle back into the comfort of your present moment, feeling the softness of your bedding and the security of your modern surroundings. The stories we have explored together of first contact and misunderstanding, of epidemic diseases and demographic collapse, of cultural destruction and creative resistance, belong to a past that is both distant and intimately connected to our contemporary world. The indigenous peoples who faced the arrival of European ships 5 centuries ago were not so different from ourselves. They lived in communities bound together by love, tradition, and shared purpose. They raised their children with hopes for the future and honored their ancestors with reverence for the past. They created art, pursued knowledge, and sought meaning in their relationships with each other and with the natural world that sustained their lives. Their encounter with forces they could neither understand nor control reminds us of the fragility of the human condition and the unpredictable nature of historical change. The civilizations that fell during the Conquest had endured for thousands of years, had survived previous challenges, and transformed themselves through countless adaptations. Yet they could not survive the particular combination of biological, technological, and cultural forces that European contact unleashed. But their story is not simply one of victimization and loss. In the midst of unimaginable catastrophe, indigenous peoples demonstrated remarkable creativity, resilience, and determination to preserve what could be preserved and adapt what needed to be changed. The cultural traditions that survive today in indigenous communities throughout the Americas represent victories won through centuries of quiet resistance and careful preservation. The colonial societies that emerged from this collision of worlds created something unprecedented in human history: cultures that were neither purely European nor purely indigenous, but reflected complex negotiations between different ways of understanding reality. These hybrid cultures enriched human diversity while serving as testimonies to the capacity of human beings to create meaning and beauty, even in circumstances shaped by violence and oppression. As you drift toward sleep, remember that you live in a world shaped by both the tragedies and the triumphs we have explored together. The foods you eat, the languages you speak, the cultural practices you take for granted, all bear traces of the cultural mixing that began with the conquest of the Americas. The global connections that characterize our modern world had their origins in the voyages of exploration that brought such devastation to indigenous societies, but also created the foundations for contemporary international exchange. The struggles for justice, cultural preservation, and environmental sustainability that characterize our contemporary world continue the resistance movements that began in the 16th century when indigenous peoples first faced the challenge of maintaining their identities in a world transformed by conquest. Their example reminds us that cultural survival requires both adaptation and resistance, both creative innovation and faithful preservation of essential traditions. Let the weight of this history settle over you like a blanket woven from memory and hope. The people whose stories we have shared faced circumstances far more challenging than any we are likely to encounter. Yet they found ways to preserve what was most precious in their heritage, while adapting to radically changed circumstances. Their resilience and creativity offer inspiration for contemporary efforts to address the challenges facing our interconnected but still unequal world. Sleep well, knowing that you are connected to this long history of human struggle and survival, and that the comfortable present moment you inhabit was made possible by countless acts of courage, creativity, and determination by people who refuse to surrender their humanity, even in the face of overwhelming force. Their ancient wisdom continues to speak to us across the centuries, reminding us that true civilization is measured not by technological power or military might, but by our capacity to maintain compassion, preserve beauty, and create meaning in partnership with each other and with the natural world that sustains all life.